Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. After the bar closed, I was tired and just wanted to get home. It was late, probably around 1 a.m., so I pulled out my phone and ordered a rideshare. I watched the little map on the app, waiting for the car to show up. A dark sedan pulled up to the curb a few minutes later. The driver didn't roll down the window, but the car matched what the app said, so I got in. As soon as I shut the door, I noticed something was off. The driver didn't say anything, just started driving. I thought maybe he was tired or just didn't feel like talking. It was late, after all. The inside of the car smelled strange, like old fast food and something else I couldn't place. I was too tired to think about it, so I just stared out the window. We drove for a few minutes in silence. Then I noticed we were heading in the wrong direction. I know my city pretty well, and this wasn't the route to my apartment. I leaned forward and asked, "Hey, isn't it faster to take Main Street?" The driver didn't answer. He just kept driving. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I checked my phone, but it was acting up, not loading the app. I tried to open the door, just to make sure it wasn't stuck or something, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. I tried the other one locked, too. "Hey, man," I said, louder this time. "I think you're going the wrong way." He didn't even glance at me. He just kept driving, his hands gripping the wheel tight, his eyes fixed on the road. My heart started pounding. I tried to stay calm, thinking maybe it was a mistake, but my gut told me something was really wrong. The streets were getting emptier as we drove into a part of town I didn't recognize. My phone was still frozen, useless. I kept trying to pull up the rideshare app, hoping to see the driver's name, but it just wouldn't load. I asked again, "Where are you taking me?" Still nothing. I could hear my own breathing getting faster, louder. I looked around the car, trying to find anything that might help, but there was nothing, just an empty back seat and a bunch of junk in the front. The driver's face was in the shadows, and I couldn't see much of him, just the outline of his head and shoulders. We turned onto a road that led out of the city, a narrow, dark stretch with no streetlights. I couldn't see any houses or businesses, just trees and the occasional field. Panic started to set in. I realized I had no idea where we were going. My hands were shaking as I tried the door locks again, but they wouldn't budge. It was like they were jammed. I decided I had to do something. I tried to stay calm, thinking of what I could say or do to make him stop. My mind was racing. "Look, man," I said, trying to sound steady, "I don't care where you're going, just let me out, okay? I won't tell anyone, just let me out." He still didn't respond, but I noticed his breathing was heavier, like he was working himself up to something. We kept driving, and I realized I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to get out of that car. I scanned the dashboard and saw the power window button on my side. I pressed it, and the window started to go down. The wind rushed in, cold and sharp. The driver looked over at me for the first time, his eyes wild and furious. He reached for the control to roll the window back up, but I didn't wait. I threw myself halfway out the window, yelling for help. The car was moving fast, and the ground was a blur beneath me. The driver grabbed my arm, yanking me back inside, but I kicked at him, trying to wriggle free. My foot hit the steering wheel, and the car swerved violently. I heard the tires screech as we veered off the road. The car slammed to a stop, and I was thrown back into the seat. My head hit the window hard, making me see stars. The driver cursed under his breath, fumbling with something in the front seat. I didn't wait to see what it was. I scrambled out of the car, half falling, half crawling onto the gravel. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran as fast as I could. My lungs burned, my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I kept going. The rain started to pour down, turning the dirt road into mud. I could hear the driver behind me, his footsteps heavy and fast, but I didn't look back. I could barely see through the rain, but I kept running, hoping to find a house or a gas station or anything. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The rain soaked through my clothes, making me shiver, but I didn't stop. I heard the driver shout something, but the wind and rain drowned it out. Finally, I saw lights ahead, the faint glow of a building in the distance. I pushed myself harder, slipping in the mud, but I didn't care. I had to get there. The footsteps behind me were getting closer, and I knew I couldn't slow down. When I reached the building, I realized it was a small diner, the kind that stays open late for truckers. I banged on the door, yelling for help. The door flew open, and I fell inside, gasping for breath. The few people inside looked at me, shocked, as I stumbled to my feet. The driver was nowhere to be seen. I turned around, expecting him to burst through the door, but he never did. I collapsed into a chair, shaking, drenched to the bone, but safe. Someone handed me a phone, and I called the police, my voice trembling as I told them what had happened. The driver's car was gone by the time they arrived. They searched the area but didn't find him. I spent the rest of the night at the police station, trying to describe the man who had taken me. But his face was a blur in my mind, lost in the chaos of that night. I still don't know who he was or what he wanted. I drove out to the farmhouse on a Friday afternoon. It was one of those places tucked far back from the main road, surrounded by fields and woods. I was a doctor in the area, and it wasn't unusual for me to make house calls for older patients who couldn't easily get to town. The man had called in earlier, saying he wasn't feeling well and that the weather was too bad to make it to the clinic. The sky was already dark, clouds rolling in, so I understood. When I pulled up to the house, it started to drizzle. The farmhouse looked old, but well kept. Paint was peeling in places, and the windows were clouded with age, but the yard was neat. The man, who said his name was John, opened the door before I could knock. He was tall, mid-50s, maybe. His clothes were clean but old, like they'd been worn for years. He had a bit of a limp, but he seemed otherwise strong. "Come in, doctor," he said, holding the door wide. "Weather's turning bad." I stepped inside, wiping my shoes on the mat. The house was dark, with only a few lamps on. The furniture was old, like the kind you find in an antique shop, but everything was in place, almost too perfect. There was a faint smell, something I couldn't place right away. I set my bag down and asked him how he was feeling. "Just a bit under the weather," he said, closing the door behind me. "My chest's been tight, and I've got this cough that won't quit. Figured it was best to have you take a look." We sat down in the living room. He was polite, asking about my drive and offering me something to drink. I politely declined. I noticed the rain picking up outside, tapping against the windows. I asked him to describe his symptoms in more detail, and he did, though something about the way he spoke seemed off. His answers were a bit too rehearsed, like he was trying to remember what he was supposed to say. As I examined him, everything seemed normal. His lungs were clear, and his heart rate was steady. I started to suspect he might just be lonely, wanting someone to talk to. But there was something about the way he watched me, how his eyes followed my every move, that made me uneasy. He asked if I could stay a bit longer, just until the storm passed. He insisted the roads would get bad quickly, and it would be safer to wait it out. I hesitated, but the rain was pouring down hard by then. The wind had picked up, howling around the corners of the house. I agreed to stay for a little while longer. He offered me tea again, and this time I accepted, thinking it might ease the tension I was feeling. He disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone in the living room. The feeling of unease grew stronger as I sat there, listening to the rain. Something was wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air in that house felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I noticed little things. The photos on the walls were all old, too old, and there were no recent ones. The books on the shelves were dusty, as if they hadn't been touched in years. When he returned with the tea, I took a small sip, pretending to drink more than I did. It tasted fine, but I didn't trust it. He sat across from me, watching, a strange look in his eyes, as if he was waiting for something. We made small talk for a bit, mostly him asking questions about my work, my life, but there was a creeping intensity in his voice, something that set my nerves on edge. Then, almost casually, he asked if I had told anyone where I was going today. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was such an odd question, out of nowhere, and it made my skin crawl. I lied, saying that my assistant knew exactly where I was and that she was expecting me to call in soon. His expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, a hint of something dark. I stood up, saying I should be going, that the storm might have let up a bit. But he stood up too, blocking my way to the door. He didn't touch me, but he was close, too close, and I felt trapped. He insisted it was too dangerous to leave now, that I should stay the night. His voice was calm, almost too calm, but there was an edge to it, something threatening just below the surface. I felt my heart start to race. I tried to make my way around him, saying I could manage the drive, but he stepped in front of me again, his face serious now. "I really think it's best you stay," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Panic was building inside me. I realized then that he had no intention of letting me leave. I tried to stay calm, to think of a way out, but my mind was racing. The phone was in my bag, but it was across the room, and I doubted he'd let me get to it. The windows were shut tight, the storm outside roaring louder, the rain hammering against the glass. I told him I needed to get something from my car, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't budge, just stared at me, his eyes cold. "There's nothing you need out there," he said. "Everything you need is right here." I knew then that I had to get out, and I had to do it fast. I took a step back, trying to keep my distance, but he moved closer, his hand reaching out as if to grab me. I bolted, running for the kitchen, hoping to find a back door or something, anything. But I heard him right behind me, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. I reached the kitchen, frantically looking for a way out. The back door was there, but it was locked, and I didn't have time to fumble with it. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy cast iron skillet, and turned just as he came into the room. I swung it with all my strength, hitting him square in the shoulder. He stumbled back, more shocked than hurt, but it gave me a few precious seconds. I ran back through the house, heading for the front door this time. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I could hear him cursing behind me, recovering quickly. I reached the door, yanking it open just as he caught up to me, grabbing my arm with a grip like iron. I screamed, struggling to break free, but he was strong, too strong. He pulled me back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I fought with everything I had, kicking, scratching, trying to get away. In the chaos, I managed to land another blow with the skillet, this time to his head. He let out a grunt, his grip loosening just enough for me to pull away. I didn't think, I just ran. I ran out the front door, into the storm. The rain was blinding, the wind whipping around me, but I didn't stop. I sprinted to my car, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I fumbled with the keys, finally jamming one into the ignition, and the engine roared to life. I slammed the car into reverse, tires spinning in the mud, and sped down the driveway, the headlights cutting through the rain. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stumble out of the house, blood running down the side of his face, watching as I drove away. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I didn't look back, didn't slow down, just kept driving, trying to get as far away as I could. My mind was racing, the fear still gripping me like a vice. It wasn't until I was miles away, on a busy road with other cars around me, that I finally pulled over. I was shaking all over, drenched in sweat, but I was safe. I grabbed my phone, hands trembling, and called the police. I told them everything, my voice barely more than a whisper. They found the farmhouse later that night, but it was empty. He was gone, and there was no sign of where he might have gone. The police searched the area, but they didn't find him. I don't know what he planned to do, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I got out. I survived. Matt and I had been talking about exploring the old train yard for weeks. We'd driven past it so many times, seeing those rusted-out cars and overgrown tracks just sitting there, and we always wondered what it would be like to go in. One Saturday afternoon, we finally decided to do it. The sky was gray, threatening rain, but we didn't care. It just made the place seem more interesting, like we'd stumbled into something out of a movie. We parked a little way down the road, not wanting to attract attention, and climbed through a gap in the fence. The yard was huge, filled with rows of train cars that looked like they hadn't moved in decades. We started walking. The only sounds were our feet crunching on gravel and the distant hum of traffic from the highway. It felt like we were miles from anywhere. As we walked between the cars, we saw all sorts of graffiti, broken windows, and bits of trash that told us we weren't the first ones to come here. But the further in we went, the less disturbed everything looked. It was like most people didn't bother going this deep into the yard. We kept walking, talking about how cool it would be to find something really old, like an abandoned conductor's cabin or a stash of old tickets. Then we saw it, an old train engine sitting on a side track. It looked different from the others, less rusted, like someone had been taking care of it, or at least hadn't let it fall apart completely. The paint was faded but still visible, dark green with yellow stripes. The windows weren't broken, and the doors were shut tight. We looked at each other, grinning like idiots, and I could tell Matt was thinking the same thing I was. We had to check it out. We climbed up onto the platform and tried the door. It was locked, but Matt found a loose piece of metal nearby and used it to pry the door open. It creaked as it swung inward, and the smell of old oil and metal hit us. Inside, it was dark, but not pitch black. Enough light filtered in through the windows to see that the controls were still there, all dusty and covered in cobwebs. We stepped inside, our footsteps echoing in the small space. I was surprised by how intact everything was. The seats were still there, the levers and buttons, even an old map pinned to the wall. Matt sat down in the conductor's chair, pretending to steer the train, making engine noises like we were kids again. I laughed, but something about the place felt a little off. I tried to shake it, telling myself it was just the atmosphere of the yard. Then Matt noticed something. One of the levers wasn't as rusty as the others. He grabbed it, giving it a tentative pull. To our surprise, it moved easily, like it had been used recently. Suddenly, the train shuddered, a low hum filling the cabin. We looked at each other, eyes wide. The train was still functional. We heard a clunk, then a low whine as the engine started to rumble. The train jerked forward a few feet, and Nat and I both stumbled, grabbing onto the nearest handholds. We hadn't expected it to actually work. Before we could react, the train began to move, slowly at first, but picking up speed. Nat tried to pull the lever back, but it wouldn't budge. The train kept going, out of the yard and onto a main track that I hadn't even noticed was connected to it. I started to panic, looking out the window as the yard disappeared behind us. We were moving faster now, the wheels clattering over the tracks. I yelled at Matt to stop it, but he was already trying, frantically flipping switches and pulling levers, but nothing worked. The train seemed to have a mind of its own. We passed through an old industrial area, long-abandoned factories and warehouses flashing by, and I realized we were heading deeper into a part of town that wasn't safe. Everyone knew to avoid this area. It was where all sorts of shady things happened. Drugs, illegal deals, worse. I told Matt we had to jump, but when we tried the doors, they were locked from the outside. The windows wouldn't budge either. The train kept going, the landscape outside getting rougher, more overgrown, with fewer buildings. The tracks were leading us into a place that felt completely cut off from the rest of the world. I started to think about the stories I'd heard, about how this part of town was used as a dumping ground, not just for trash, but for bodies. People who saw things they shouldn't have. I looked at Matt, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing. Then, up ahead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were figures standing by the tracks, a group of men, all watching the train as it approached. They weren't just random people hanging out. They were waiting for us. I saw a flash of something metallic in one of their hands, a gun, or maybe a crowbar. I didn't know, but it didn't matter. We were in serious trouble. I grabbed Matt, pulling him away from the controls. We had to hide, to get out of sight before the train stopped. We scrambled towards the back of the cabin, finding a small storage compartment barely big enough to fit both of us. We squeezed in, pulling the door shut just as the train began to slow down. The train came to a halt with a jolt, and I could hear the men outside. They were talking, but I couldn't make out the words. Then there was the sound of footsteps on the metal stairs, and the door to the cabin creaked open. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give us away. I could hear them moving around, opening drawers, rummaging through the cabin. They were looking for something or someone. I held my breath, not daring to move, hoping they wouldn't think to check the compartment. But the footsteps were getting closer, and I could see shadows moving under the door. Suddenly, the door to our hiding spot was yanked open, and I was staring up into the face of a man with a scar running down his cheek. He grinned when he saw us, and I knew then that we weren't getting out of this easily. He grabbed me by the arm, yanking me out and throwing me to the floor. Matt tried to fight back, but another man came in and kicked him hard in the ribs, sending him sprawling. They dragged us out of the train, the rain starting to fall in heavy sheets. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by tall grass and twisted trees. The men circled us, and I could see they weren't just some random group. They were organized, and they had plans for us. One of them, a man with a thick beard and a dead look in his eyes, stepped forward. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Now you've seen too much." I tried to explain, to tell him we didn't mean to, that it was an accident, but he wasn't listening. He just kept looking at me, like he was deciding what to do next. I could see Matt out of the corner of my eye, still on the ground, holding his side where he'd been kicked. Then, without warning, the man pulled out a knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. My heart skipped a beat, and I thought this was it, that we were done for. But then I noticed something, a flicker of headlights in the distance, growing brighter as a car approached. The men saw it too, and they hesitated. The bearded man cursed under his breath, shoving me away. "Get rid of them," he snapped at the others. "Now!" One of the men grabbed Matt, dragging him to his feet, and started pulling him towards the trees. I was about to fight back, to do something, anything, when the car came into view, its headlights cutting through the rain. It was an old truck, and it skidded to a stop a few yards away. The driver's door flew open, and a man jumped out, holding a shotgun. "Let them go," he shouted, aiming the gun at the group. The men froze, their eyes darting between the shotgun and us. The bearded man looked furious, but he didn't make a move. Instead, he spat on the ground and signaled to the others. "Get in the train," he ordered. "We're leaving." The men let go of us, backing away slowly, and climbed back into the train. The engine roared to life again, and the train began to move, rolling away into the darkness. I stood there, soaked to the skin, shaking from adrenaline, watching as they disappeared into the night. The man with the shotgun lowered his weapon and came over to us. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a rough look about him, but there was something kind in his eyes. He helped Matt up, asking if we were okay. We nodded, still in shock, and he gestured for us to get into his truck. "You boys are lucky I was passing through," he said. "This place isn't safe after dark." We didn't need to be told twice. We climbed into the truck, and he drove us out of there, back towards town. I didn't know who he was, or why he'd been there, but I was just grateful that he'd shown up when he did. As we drove, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. We'd gotten out, but just barely. And I knew that if we hadn't been so lucky, we wouldn't have made it back at all. The man dropped us off near our car, and we thanked him, though it didn't feel like enough. He just nodded, telling us to stay out of trouble, and then he was gone, disappearing into the night. Matt and I got in our car, not saying much as we drove home. I knew we were both thinking the same thing, that we'd never go back to that train yard again. We'd seen enough to last a lifetime. Rachel and I hadn't been to the old house in years. We used to sneak in when we were kids, daring each other to go up to the attic or down into the basement. It was just something to do when we were bored. We knew it was abandoned, and no one ever came around, so we felt like it was our little secret place. A few weeks ago, Rachel mentioned it again, out of nowhere. We were just sitting around, talking about how boring our lives had gotten since we grew up and how we missed the old days when everything felt like an adventure. That's when she said, "Why don't we go back to the house?" I was surprised she even remembered it, but once she brought it up, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The idea of sneaking back in felt thrilling, like we could relive some of that excitement from our childhood. We decided to go on a Saturday, late in the afternoon when we thought no one would be around to see us. It was cloudy when we got there, the sky dark and heavy like it might rain any minute. The house looked the same, only more run down. The paint was peeling, and the windows were grimy. The front door was still locked, but we knew the back door was always loose. We slipped around the side, our shoes crunching on the gravel driveway that was overgrown with weeds. The back door creaked as we pushed it open, and the smell of dust and damp would hit us as we stepped inside. Everything was just like we remembered, old furniture covered in sheets, cobwebs hanging in the corners, and the floor creaking under our weight. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I told myself it was just the memories making me nervous. We started walking through the rooms, laughing about the old times, like when we thought the house was haunted and scared ourselves silly over nothing. but the more we wandered, the quieter we got. There was something different about the place now, something that didn't sit right with me. The air felt heavy, and I started noticing things I hadn't before. There was a stack of newspapers in the corner of the living room that looked too recent to belong in an abandoned house. I pointed it out to Rachel, and she just shrugged, but I could tell she was starting to feel uneasy too. We kept going, moving up the creaky stairs to the second floor. The hallway was dark, and I had to pull out my phone to use as a flashlight. We reached the end of the hall where the master bedroom was. Rachel opened the door slowly, and we both stepped inside. The room was mostly empty, just like the others, but then we noticed the closet door was slightly open. Rachel looked at me, and I could see the nervousness in her eyes, but we didn't say anything. She reached out and pushed the closet door open all the way. Inside, there was a sleeping bag rolled up in the corner, along with a small pile of clothes and a few empty cans of food. It was clear someone had been living here, recently too. My heart started to race as I realized this wasn't just a forgotten place anymore. Someone else was using it now, and we had no idea who it was or when they might come back. Rachel turned to me, her face pale. "We should go," she whispered, and I nodded, already backing out of the room. We tried to be as quiet as possible, but every step we took made the floorboards creak louder than before. We were halfway down the stairs when we heard the front door opening. I froze, grabbing Rachel's arm. We both stared at each other, wide-eyed, and I could see the panic rising in her face. Whoever was at the front door wasn't just passing by. We heard heavy footsteps moving through the house, slow and deliberate, like they were checking the rooms. We needed to get out, but the only way was through the back door, and to get there, we had to pass by the living room where the footsteps were heading. My mind raced, trying to think of another way out, but there wasn't one. Rachel squeezed my arm, pulling me back up the stairs. We couldn't risk running into whoever it was, not when we didn't know if they were dangerous. We made it back to the master bedroom, our footsteps quieter now, barely daring to breathe. We slipped inside and closed the door behind us as gently as we could, hoping they wouldn't notice it had been moved. I motioned to Rachel to get in the closet. It wasn't the best hiding spot, but it was all we had. We climbed into the closet, trying to fit ourselves into the dark corner where the sleeping bag was. We could hear the footsteps getting closer, moving up the stairs now. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. I tried to calm my breathing, but it was no use. The fear was taking over, making it impossible to think clearly. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs, then paused. I squeezed Rachel's hand, holding onto her for dear life. We heard the floorboards creak as they moved down the hall, closer and closer. Then, they stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, waiting, praying they wouldn't come in. But then the door creaked open, and I felt Rachel stiffen beside me. Whoever it was, they were inside the room now, just a few feet away from us. I could hear them breathing, slow and steady, like they were taking their time, maybe even enjoying the fear they were causing. They started moving around the room, their footsteps heavy on the floor. I could hear them opening drawers, rummaging through the old furniture. They were looking for something, or maybe just making sure no one was there. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. Rachel was shaking beside me, and I could feel my own hands trembling too. Then, the footsteps came closer to the closet. I felt my heart stop as they paused right outside. The door handle rattled, and I knew they were about to open it. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for whatever was about to happen. But then, something outside caught their attention. A car horn blared in the distance, echoing through the empty house. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then I heard them move away from the closet, back towards the door. I opened my eyes, daring to hope they might leave. The door to the bedroom creaked again, and then the footsteps were moving down the hall, back towards the stairs. We waited, listening as they went back down, through the living room and out the front door. I didn't move until I heard the door slam shut, and the sound of footsteps faded away outside. Rachel let out a shaky breath, and I realized I'd been holding mine too. We stayed in the closet for what felt like forever, just to make sure they were really gone. When we finally climbed out, we didn't say anything. We just knew we had to get out of there, fast. We slipped out of the room, down the stairs, and through the back door, running as fast as we could until we were out of the yard and back on the road. We didn't stop until we reached Rachel's car, and even then, we didn't talk about what had just happened. We got in the car and drove away, the owl shrinking into the distance behind us. I kept looking back, half expecting to see someone following us, but there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching out ahead. We never went back to that house, and we never talked about it again. I first noticed him watching me a few months ago. At first, I didn't think much of it. We're neighbors, after all. He lived across the street in a small, single-story house with a neat little lawn. I'd see him out there sometimes, mowing or watering his flowers. He seemed harmless, just a quiet older man who kept to himself. But then it started happening more often. I'd come home from work late, and I'd see him standing by his window, just standing there, staring out at my house. At night, when I'd sit on the couch watching TV, I'd catch a glimpse of him across the street, standing on his porch, always looking my way. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just lonely. I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I tried to ignore it. But I couldn't ignore the feeling I got every time I saw him. It was like a knot in my stomach, tightening every time our eyes met. I started closing my blinds, keeping my curtains shut, but it didn't help. I'd still feel his eyes on me, even when I couldn't see him. It got to the point where I checked my windows before I did anything, make dinner, watch TV, even just walk to the bathroom. I knew it was getting to me, but I didn't know what to do about it. Then things started to get weird inside my house. At first, it was small stuff, things I could brush off as forgetfulness. My keys wouldn't be where I'd left them. A glass I knew I'd washed would be back in the sink. I kept thinking I was just tired, stressed from work, maybe not paying attention. But then it got worse. One night, I came home and found the front door unlocked. I was sure I'd locked it before I left, but there it was, slightly ajar. My heart started pounding, but I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Everything looked normal at first, but then I noticed the picture frames on the hallway table had been moved. They were crooked, like someone had brushed against them. I told myself maybe I'd bumped into them in the morning, but I knew I hadn't. The air in the house felt different, like someone had been there while I was gone. But nothing was missing, so I tried to forget about it. I locked the door and double-checked all the windows before I went to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Over the next few days, more things started to change. My books were out of order on the shelves. The throw pillows on the couch were moved. The food in my fridge was shifted around. I couldn't explain it, but I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. I didn't want to believe someone had been in my house. But then I found the note. It was just a small piece of paper tucked under the pillow on my bed. I found it one night when I was getting ready to sleep. My heart dropped when I saw it. There was nothing written on it, just a blank piece of paper, but I knew it hadn't been there before. Someone had been in my bedroom. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, listening to every creak and groan the house made, every little noise that might have been someone trying to get in. The thought that my neighbor had been inside my house made my skin crawl. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. The next day, I called a locksmith and had all the locks changed. I even put in a new deadbolt on the front door and installed a security system. I felt a little safer, but not much. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that he was still watching me, still waiting for another chance. I started seeing him more often after that. Every time I looked out the window, there he was, standing on his porch or at his window, just watching. I started parking my car in the garage so he couldn't see when I came home. I stopped going outside unless I absolutely had to. I felt like a prisoner in my own home. Then one night, I came home and found my back door open. The security system hadn't gone off, so I thought maybe I'd forgotten to close it all the way in the morning. But when I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air felt heavy, like someone had been there. I walked through the house, checking every room, but nothing seemed out of place. But then I went into my bedroom, and that's when I saw it. The blankets on my bed were pulled back, like someone had been lying there. My clothes were thrown across the floor, and my dresser drawers were open. But what really made my blood run cold was the note on my pillow. This time, there was something written on it. I see you. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I grabbed my phone and called the police. They came and searched the house, but they didn't find anyone. They said it was probably just a prank, but I knew better. I told them about my neighbor, about how he'd been watching me, how things had been moving around in my house. They took a report, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. I started staying with a friend after that. I couldn't go back to the house, not after what happened. But I still had to go back sometimes to get clothes, to check the mail. Every time I went, I felt like I was being watched. And every time, I found something else moved, another note, another reminder that he was still out there, still watching me. The last time I went to the house, I found the front door wide open. I hadn't been there in days, so I knew I hadn't left it that way. I didn't go inside. I just turned around and got back in my car, driving away as fast as I could. I sold the house after that. I couldn't live there anymore, not knowing he was still out there. I don't know where he is now, or if he's watching someone else, but I still get the feeling sometimes, like someone's eyes are on me. I was out hiking alone. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just a few hours out and back to clear my head. I'd done this trail before, knew it pretty well. But that day, I must have lost track of where I was because I ended up taking a wrong turn. At first, I didn't realize it. The path seemed normal enough, just a bit narrower than I remembered. The trees grew thicker as I went on, blocking out more of the sky. I figured it was just part of the trail I hadn't noticed before. But after about an hour of walking, I realized something was off. The ground was uneven, covered in roots that I kept tripping over. The trail itself was barely there, more like a deer path than something meant for people. I thought about turning back, but I kept going. I don't know why. Maybe I was too stubborn to admit I was lost, or maybe I was curious. Either way, I pushed on. The woods got denser, and the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I kept walking until I saw something through the trees up ahead. It was a fence, old and rusted, with barbed wire running along the top. It was weird, finding something like that out in the middle of nowhere. The fence stretched out in both directions, disappearing into the trees. I followed it for a while until I came to a gate. It was open, just a crack, like someone had forgotten to close it all the way. There was a sign next to the gate, but it was so faded I couldn't read it. I should have turned around then. I should have gone back the way I came, but instead, I went through the gate. Inside, the trees cleared out a bit, and I could see buildings in the distance. They were old, run down, and looked abandoned. The whole place had an eerie feel to it, like it had been forgotten by time. I thought maybe it was an old military base or something, left to rot in the woods. But as I got closer, I saw there were people there. They were moving around between the buildings, but something about them felt off. They were dressed in ragged clothes, dirty and worn. They didn't look like they belonged there. I stayed back, hiding behind a tree, trying to figure out what I'd stumbled into. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, like something rotting, but the closer I got, the stronger it became. It was the smell of death. I felt my stomach turn, and I had to fight the urge to gag. I wanted to leave, but before I could move, one of the people saw me. It was a man, tall and thin, with wild hair and eyes that seemed too big for his face. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with a look that made my skin crawl. I started backing away, but then he yelled out, and suddenly, everyone else was looking at me too. Panic set in, and I turned to run, but they were faster. I heard them coming after me, their footsteps pounding on the ground. I ran as fast as I could, crashing through the trees, but they caught up to me. They grabbed me, pulling me down, and I hit the ground hard. They didn't say anything, just started dragging me back toward the compound. I tried to fight, but there were too many of them. They were strong, their hands rough and cold. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and all I could think about was that smell. It was everywhere, so strong now that I could taste it in the back of my throat. They took me to one of the buildings, shoving me inside. It was dark and damp, with mold growing on the walls. There were no windows, just a single door that they locked behind me. I was trapped. I sat there in the dark, trying to make sense of what was happening. My head was spinning, my heart still racing. I didn't know what they were going to do to me, but I knew it wasn't good. After what felt like hours, the door creaked open, and the man who had spotted me stepped inside. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching me. Then he started talking, his voice low and raspy. He told me I shouldn't have come here, that this place wasn't for people like me. He said they couldn't let me leave. I tried to reason with him, begged him to let me go, but he just shook his head. He said I'd seen too much. He told me they were hiding something they couldn't risk getting out. I didn't understand what he meant, but I knew I was in serious trouble. Then he turned and walked out, leaving me alone in the dark again. I could hear them talking outside, their voices muffled but urgent. I had to get out of there, but I didn't know how. The door was locked, and there were no windows. I felt around in the dark, looking for anything I could use to defend myself, but there was nothing. The smell was stronger in that room, almost overwhelming. I could barely breathe. My hands brushed against something wet on the floor, and I realized it was blood. I recoiled, my stomach churning. I didn't want to know what had happened in that room, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes, it was hard to tell in the dark. I could hear them moving around outside, their footsteps getting closer, then farther away. I didn't know what they were planning, but I knew I had to act fast. Then I heard the door unlock. It opened slowly, and I saw a figure standing there. It wasn't the man from before. It was a woman, younger, with a look of fear in her eyes. She whispered for me to be quiet, then motioned for me to follow her. I didn't have a choice. I got up and followed her out of the building. She led me through the compound, staying close to the shadows. I could see the other people in the distance, but they didn't notice us. She took me to the gate, the same one I had come through. She told me to run and not look back. I didn't ask any questions. I just ran. I didn't stop until I was far away from that place, back in the familiar part of the woods. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they would give out, but I kept going. I didn't look back. When I finally made it back to my car, I was shaking. I drove away as fast as I could, not caring where I was going, just needing to get as far from that place as possible. I don't know what they were hiding in that compound, and I don't want to know. I just know I'm lucky to be alive. I haven't gone hiking since, and I don't think I ever will again. The thought of getting lost, of stumbling onto something I shouldn't see, is too much for me to handle. I still see that woman's face in my mind sometimes. I wonder if she got out too, or if they found her after she helped me escape. I'll never know, and maybe it's better that way. When Emily and I first saw the mansion, it looked perfect. It was old, sure, but that was part of its charm. The stone walls were covered in ivy, and the windows had those little diamond panes you only see in really old houses. We thought it'd be the perfect place to spend a weekend, just the two of us away from the city. The woman who met us at the door was nice enough. She was older, probably in her 60s, and she moved a bit slow. She gave us the keys and showed us around. The place was huge, bigger than it looked from the outside. There were 4 floors, with more rooms than we could count, and each one was filled with antique furniture and old paintings. The floors creaked with every step, and there was this smell, like dust and something else I couldn't place. But it was beautiful in its own way. Before she left, the woman gave us one warning: "Don't go into the attic," she said. "It's not safe up there. The floorboards are rotten." We nodded, thinking nothing of it. Why would we want to go up there anyway? We had the whole rest of the house to explore. The first night was quiet. We made dinner in the old kitchen, then sat by the fireplace in the living room. The fire crackled and popped, and the sound was almost soothing. But as the night went on, the house started to feel different. It wasn't anything we could put our finger on, just a sense that we weren't really alone. Around midnight, I heard footsteps upstairs. I told myself it was just the house settling, but the sound didn't stop. Emily noticed it too. She asked if I'd heard it, and I nodded, but we didn't talk about it. We just sat there, listening, until the footsteps finally faded away. The next day, the curiosity started to get to us. The attic had been in the back of our minds since the woman mentioned it. We kept talking about what could be up there. Maybe it was just old junk, or maybe there was something more interesting. The more we thought about it, the more we wanted to see for ourselves. In the afternoon, we couldn't resist any longer. We found the door to the attic at the end of a long hallway on the top floor. The wood was old and splintered, and the door itself was painted a dull, peeling white. I hesitated for a moment, but then Emily grabbed the handle and pulled it open. The stairs were steep and narrow, leading up into darkness. The smell was stronger up here, musty and damp, mixed with something that made my stomach turn. But we went up anyway. The attic was big, bigger than I expected. There were boxes piled up in the corners, covered in dust and cobwebs. The only light came from a single window at the far end, but it was enough to see by. Emily and I started looking around, opening boxes and rifling through old things. Most of it was just junk, old clothes, and broken furniture. But then we found something that made us stop. In the far corner of the attic, there was a small door, almost hidden behind a stack of boxes. It was different from the other doors in the house. This one was made of heavy, dark wood, and it had a big iron lock on it. Emily looked at me. and I knew what she was thinking. We had to see what was inside. The lock was old and rusty, and it broke off easily when I hit it with a piece of wood. Inside the small room was nothing like the rest of the attic. It was clean, almost too clean, like someone had been in there recently. There was a bed in the corner, neatly made, and a table with a few old books on it. But what caught our attention was the walls. They were covered in writing, scrawled in what looked like charcoal. It was hard to make out the words at first, but as we got closer, we could see they were names. Dozens of them, written over and over again. Underneath the names, there were dates. They went back years, some as far as the 1800s. But there were more recent ones too, all the way up to just a few years ago. My heart started pounding as I realized what we were looking at. These were the names of people who had stayed in the house, just like us. Then Emily found something that made everything worse. In the corner of the room, there was a stack of old newspapers. The top one was dated from 10 years ago, and the headline caught my eye: "Couple disappears after renting local mansion." I grabbed the paper and flipped through it. The story was about a couple who had rented the house for a weekend, just like us. They were never seen again. The article said the police had searched the house but found no evidence of foul play. The case was still unsolved. We didn't want to believe it, but the more we looked, the more we found. There were other articles, all about people who had gone missing after staying in the mansion. And then, behind a loose floorboard, Emily found something that made my blood run cold. It was a photo, old and faded, of a couple standing in front of the mansion. They were smiling, but their eyes looked hollow, almost scared. And underneath the photo, in that same charcoal, someone had written their names on the floor. We had to get out of there. We turned to leave, but as we did, we heard the footsteps again, coming from the hallway outside the attic. They were slow and deliberate, getting closer with each step. We froze, not sure what to do. The footsteps stopped right outside the attic door. We waited, barely breathing, but nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I took a step forward, ready to make a run for it. But then the door slammed shut, trapping us inside. We were in the dark, surrounded by the names of people who had never left. Emily was shaking, and I could barely think straight. We had to find a way out, but the only way was through that door. I grabbed the handle and yanked it open, but no one was there. The hallway was empty. We didn't wait to find out what was going on. We ran down the stairs, not stopping until we were outside, in the fresh air. We didn't even bother to grab our things. As we drove away, I looked back at the mansion. It stood there, silent and dark, like it was waiting for its next visitors. I knew we'd gotten lucky, that we'd made it out when so many others hadn't. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us, even as we left it behind. We never reported what we found. I don't know if anyone else ever will. But I do know one thing: I'll never go near that place again, and I'll never forget what we saw in that attic. I hired him because I needed the help. Running a farm on my own wasn't easy, and the days were getting longer with more work piling up. He came around one afternoon, just walking down the road. His clothes were worn, and he looked like he'd been on the move for a while. Said his name was Tom. I didn't ask too many questions. I just needed someone to help with the animals and the land. At first, things went fine. Tom was quiet, kept to himself mostly. He knew his way around the farm work, and I was glad to have the extra pair of hands. The animals seemed to like him well enough, which was a good sign, or so I thought. It gave me some peace of mind, knowing I wasn't out here alone. A week or so in, I started noticing little things that didn't sit right with me. A couple of chickens went missing one night. I thought maybe a fox got into the coop, but there wasn't any sign of a struggle. It was strange, but I didn't dwell on it too much. Tom didn't say anything about it, and I figured it was just bad luck. But then more animals started disappearing. A sheep one night, a goat the next. There were no tracks, no blood, just gone. I asked Tom if he'd seen anything, but he just shook his head, said he didn't know what could be happening. I wanted to believe him, so I did, even though I felt uneasy about it. The noises began not long after. It was usually late at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep. I'd hear something outside, like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the house. I'd get up, look out the window, but there was never anything there. The first time, I thought it was just my imagination, but it kept happening, almost every night. I mentioned the noises to Tom, trying to keep it casual. He looked at me with those pale blue eyes of his and said he hadn't heard anything. There was something off in the way he said it, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was nothing. Then one evening, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I was getting ready to turn in for the night when I noticed my house key wasn't on the hook by the door where I always left it. I searched the whole house, but it was nowhere to be found. I started to panic, wondering if I'd lost it somewhere outside. That's when I saw Tom sitting on the porch, just staring out at the field. I don't know why, but I walked out there, and before I could stop myself, I asked him if he'd seen my key. He didn't answer at first, just kept looking out at the dark. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled it out, holding it up like it was the most natural thing in the world. I felt my blood run cold. I asked him why he had it, trying to keep my voice steady. He just shrugged, said he found it outside and meant to give it back. But the way he said it, like he didn't care, like it wasn't a big deal, made my skin crawl. I took the key from him, my hand shaking, and went back inside, locking the door behind me. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about all the animals that had gone missing, the noises, and now this. I knew I couldn't trust him, but I didn't know what to do. It was just the two of us out here, and I was scared. The next day, I decided to keep an eye on him. I watched him from the window as he went about the chores, acting like everything was normal. But there was something in the way he moved, like he was waiting for something, and it put me on edge. That evening, I made up my mind. I'd tell him I didn't need his help anymore, that he had to leave. I couldn't have him around, not after what had happened. But when I went to find him, he was gone. His things were still in the shed where he slept, but he wasn't there. I checked the barn, the fields, even the woods at the edge of the property, but there was no sign of him. The sun was starting to set, and I felt that same cold fear creeping up my spine. I went back to the house, locked the door, and grabbed the old shotgun I kept for emergencies. The night was the longest I can remember. Every sound, every creak of the house had me on edge. I kept expecting to see him at the window or hear him trying to get inside. But the night passed without incident, and when the sun finally came up, I felt a wave of relief. Tom didn't come back. His things were still in the shed, but he was gone. I didn't try to look for him. I didn't want to know where he went or what he might have been planning. I just wanted him to be gone. I moved his things out of the shed the next day, threw them into the old well at the back of the property. I didn't want any reminder of him left on my land. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting. The animals stopped disappearing after that, and the noises at night went away. But I don't feel safe here anymore. Every time I hear the wind rustle the trees, or a branch creak outside, I wonder if it's him, coming back for something he left behind. I keep the shotgun close now, and I don't sleep as well as I used to. I know I was lucky to get him off my property without anything worse happening, but I can't help but wonder what his real intentions were, what he was planning. I don't think I'll ever find out, and maybe that's for the best. But one thing's for sure, I'll never hire another drifter again. It was a cold night, and the city felt unusually quiet. I went out for a jog in Central Park, something I've done countless times before, especially when I can't sleep. The park has this eerie calmness to it at night, but I liked it. It felt like my own world, away from the chaos of the city. The air was crisp, and my breath made little clouds as I started running along the familiar path. The lampposts cast long shadows, and I could hear the leaves crunching under my feet. I didn't see anyone else around, which wasn't surprising for that time of night. It was just me, the trees, and the sound of my own breathing. After about 10 minutes in, I noticed someone up ahead. He was walking, just a dark figure in the distance, moving slowly. I didn't think much of it at first. It's a big park, and there's always someone around, even at night. But as I got closer, I noticed he wasn't just walking, he seemed to be pacing, like he was waiting for something. I decided to run past him quickly, keeping my eyes straight ahead. As I passed him, I couldn't help but glance over. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie, the hood pulled up, so I couldn't see his face clearly. But I felt his eyes on me as I ran by, like he was watching me, tracking my every move. I picked up my pace, trying to put some distance between us. But then I heard footsteps behind me. They were light at first, almost in sync with mine. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe he just started walking in the same direction. But the sound didn't fade, it stayed right behind me. My heart began to race, faster than it should have for just a jog. I glanced back, and there he was, no longer walking, but jogging now. He was keeping pace with me, just far enough behind to make me nervous, but not close enough to seem like an immediate threat. Still, I didn't like it. I decided to test it out. I sped up, pushing myself harder, the cold air burning in my lungs. But so did he. I could hear his footsteps getting louder, matching my pace exactly. My mind started to race, thinking of all the stories you hear about late-night joggers, about people who go missing. I tried to calm myself down, thinking maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was just another runner, trying to challenge himself by keeping up with me. But that didn't feel right. There was something off about the way he moved, too deliberate, too focused. I turned sharply onto another path, hoping to lose him, but when I looked back, he was still there, closer now. His hood was still up, and I couldn't make out his face, just the dark silhouette of his body moving in time with mine. Panic started to set in. My legs were burning, but I forced them to move faster. I knew the park well, knew where the paths led, but everything felt different in the dark. I tried to remember where the nearest exit was, but my thoughts were jumbled, fear clouding my mind. The footsteps were getting louder, closer. I could almost feel him behind me. My breath was coming in short, sharp gasps now, and my chest felt tight. I needed to get out of the park, to find someone, anyone. But the path seemed to stretch on forever, and there was no one else around. I thought about stopping, confronting him, but the idea terrified me. What if he was dangerous? What if he had a weapon? I couldn't risk it. So I kept running, my legs feeling like they were about to give out, my heart pounding in my ears. Then I saw it, a light in the distance, the exit to the park. Relief washed over me, but I didn't slow down. I sprinted toward the light, hoping to find safety on the other side. But as I got closer, I heard the footsteps quicken, and he was right on my heels. I burst through the exit, into the streetlights and the noise of the city. But when I turned around, there was no one there. He was gone, vanished into the darkness of the park. I stood there, gasping for breath, looking around wildly, but I didn't see him. I didn't stop running until I was back at my apartment, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. When I finally got inside, I locked the door behind me and collapsed on the floor, my body trembling. I don't know how long I sat there, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I kept thinking about that man, the way he had followed me, matching my every move. It was like he was toying with me, enjoying my fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere in the park, waiting for his next victim. I haven't been back to Central Park at night since then. I don't think I ever will. That sense of calm I used to feel there is gone, replaced by a lingering fear that someone is always watching, waiting in the shadows. Tony and I had always been drawn to abandoned places, and this old warehouse on the outskirts of town had caught our eye for a while. It was huge, with broken windows and peeling paint. We figured it would be an interesting place to explore, and the thrill of discovering something hidden made it tempting. We planned to check it out one Saturday afternoon. The weather was fine, and the sun was out, but the warehouse loomed over us, casting long shadows even in daylight. We pushed open the rusty door and stepped inside. The air was musty and thick with dust. The light from the few windows that weren't boarded up barely reached the interior. The first thing we noticed was the silence. It was so quiet you could hear the creaks of the old building settling. We ventured further in, our footsteps echoing off the concrete floors. There were old crates, broken furniture, and scattered debris everywhere. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. We wandered through different rooms, taking pictures and exploring every nook and cranny. Most of it was what we expected: old machinery, rusted metal, and graffiti on the walls. But then we came across a door at the end of a dark hallway. It was locked, but we could see light seeping through the cracks. We tried to push it open, but it was stuck. Curiosity got the best of us, and we decided to find another way in. We managed to find a small window that was just big enough to squeeze through. We climbed in, landing softly on a pile of old rags. It was a large, open space, filled with the smell of damp and decay. As we started to explore, we heard voices. We stopped dead in our tracks, straining to listen. It sounded like a group of people talking, laughing, and shouting. We looked at each other with wide eyes, realizing we might not be alone. We quickly moved to hide behind some crates, our hearts racing. From our hiding spot, we saw a group of men entering the warehouse. They were loud and carried themselves with a certain arrogance. They seemed to know the place well, moving with purpose. We could hear snippets of their conversation, talk about deals, money, and plans. It was clear they were not just hanging out. This was some kind of meeting place for them. Tony and I exchanged worried glances. We were trapped. We had come in through a window, and the door we come through was now blocked by the group. We needed to find a way out, but our options were limited. We stayed quiet, trying to stay out of sight. The group was too focused on their meeting to notice us at first. One of the men, who seemed to be in charge, started handing out packages and making phone calls. It was obvious they were conducting some sort of illegal transaction. The seriousness of their actions made our situation even more frightening. We needed to get out before we got caught up in whatever they were doing. Tony whispered that we should try to find another exit. We started to move carefully, trying to avoid making any noise. We slid through a maze of crates and old machinery, peeking around corners to see if we could find a way out. The men were still busy, but their voices were getting closer. As we approached what looked like another exit, we heard a noise behind us. One of the men had seen us. He shouted something, and suddenly, the group was on high alert. We ran as fast as we could, adrenaline pumping. We darted through the warehouse, trying to remember the layout and where the windows were. The gang was chasing us, their shouts echoing through the empty building. We could hear their footsteps pounding behind us. We finally reached the window we had entered through, but it was blocked from the outside. We were trapped. There was no way out except to face the gang. In a panic, we scrambled to find another exit. We found a small door that led to a loading dock area. It was partially open, and we squeezed through just in time. The gang was close, but we made it outside. We ran as fast as we could, not stopping until we were back in the safety of the city streets. Breathing heavily, we looked back at the warehouse. We could see the gang still moving around inside, but they had stopped chasing us. We were safe for now, but the experience left us shaken. We didn't talk much on the way home, both of us lost in our own thoughts. We never went back to that warehouse. The thrill of exploration was overshadowed by the fear of what we had almost walked into. The encounter with the gang made it clear that some places are better left undisturbed, and some adventures are too dangerous to pursue. I used to deliver pizzas. It was an easy job, not much to it. Drive around, drop off pizzas, get a few bucks in tips, and head home. Nothing crazy. But there was this one night that I can't shake, and I don't think I ever will. It was a Friday night, around 10 p.m., and I got this delivery out to an address I'd never been to before. The house was way out on the edge of town, near the woods. It was an isolated place, not a house around for miles. I remember thinking it was strange that someone would even order pizza that far out, but I didn't question it. People get hungry, and I needed the tips. When I got to the house, it was dark. No lights on, no cars in the driveway. I checked the address again to make sure I was at the right place. Yep, it was the right spot. I figured maybe they were out back or something, so I got out of the car and walked up to the front door. I knocked a couple of times, but no one answered. I knocked harder, thinking they just didn't hear me, but still nothing. At this point, I was getting frustrated. It was cold out, and I just wanted to get back in the car and move on. I decided to try the doorbell, but when I pressed it, I didn't hear a sound. It wasn't working. That's when I noticed the door was slightly open. Not much, just a crack. I pushed the door a little, calling out, "Hello? Pizza delivery." But no one answered. I didn't want to just leave the pizza on the porch in case animals got to it, so I stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was this weird, metallic smell, like blood. I've never smelled anything like it before, and it made my stomach turn. The hallway was dark, but there was a light coming from a room down the hall. I walked towards it, pizza box still in my hand, thinking maybe someone was in there. As I got closer, the smell got stronger. When I reached the doorway, I froze. There was blood everywhere. On the walls, the floor, and the furniture. It looked like a fight had happened, and it wasn't pretty. I saw a knife on the ground, covered in blood. My heart started pounding, and I could feel the panic rising. I knew I shouldn't be there. I should have turned around and left right then, but I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Then I heard a noise. It was faint, like someone moving around upstairs. That snapped me out of it. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard the front door creak open. I was trapped. I couldn't go out the way I came in without running into whoever had just entered. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. There was a door to the kitchen off to the side, so I ducked in there, hoping I could find another way out. The kitchen was just as bad. Dishes were smashed, and there was more blood. I saw a back door, and my heart leaped. I grabbed the handle, but it was locked. I started to panic, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. Then I heard voices. Two men, talking quietly but urgently. They were in the hallway, right outside the kitchen. I could hear them saying something about cleaning up and getting rid of it. I knew if they found me, I was dead. I finally got the lock undone and pushed the door open as quietly as I could. I slipped out into the night, closing the door softly behind me. I was in the backyard now, and I could see the tree line not far off. I knew I had to make it to the trees without them seeing me. I crouched low and moved as quickly as I could across the yard. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure they'd hear it. When I reached the trees, I didn't stop. I kept running, branches whipping in my face, the pizza long forgotten. I didn't stop until I couldn't run anymore, collapsing against a tree, gasping for breath. I listened, but all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. No one was following me. I stayed in those woods for what felt like hours, too scared to move. Eventually, I made my way back to the road and walked until I found a house with lights on. I knocked on the door, and when they answered, I must have looked like a mess. They called the police for me. When the cops arrived, I told them everything. They took me back to the house, but by then, the place was empty. No bodies, no blood, nothing. Just an empty, dark house. They said I must have been mistaken, that maybe I saw something else, but I know what I saw. I'll never forget that smell or the look of that room. I quit the pizza job the next day. I couldn't keep doing it, not after what I'd seen. I don't know who those guys were or what they were doing, but I'm just glad I got out alive. I still think about it sometimes, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't gotten that back door open in time. I don't think I'd be here to tell the story. My car started sputtering about an hour after sunset, and I knew something was wrong. The engine light blinked on, and I could feel the car losing power. I was on a stretch of highway with nothing around but trees and darkness. Panic started to set in, but I tried to stay calm. I could barely see the road signs in the dim light, but I saw one that said there was a rest stop a couple of miles ahead. I figured I could make it there and check things out. By the time I pulled into the rest stop, my car was barely running. It was one of those small, isolated rest stops with a couple of vending machines and a dingy bathroom. The whole place looked deserted, but I didn't have much of a choice. I parked under one of the few working lights and got out to pop the hood. I'm not great with cars, but I thought maybe I could spot something obvious. The engine was steaming, and the smell of burning oil hit me. I knew it wasn't good. I was standing there, staring at the engine, when I heard the sound of a truck pulling in. A big rig rumbled into the lot and parked a little ways from me. The driver's door opened, and a man climbed out. He was a big guy, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dirty cap and a stained t-shirt. He waved at me, and I gave a small, nervous wave back. He started walking over, and my stomach twisted with unease. "Car trouble?" he asked, looking over my shoulder at the engine. His voice was rough, but not unfriendly. "Yeah, it just started acting up," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded and leaned in to look at the engine. Mind if I take a look? I hesitated, but I didn't really know what else to do. Sure, if you don't mind. He started poking around under the hood, muttering to himself. I stood there, feeling more and more uncomfortable. Something about him didn't sit right with me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid. Looks like your radiator's shot, he said after a few minutes. You're not going anywhere without getting it fixed. Great, I muttered, my heart sinking. I didn't have the tools or the knowledge to fix that. He glanced at me, his eyes lingering a little too long. I could give you a ride to the next town. There's a garage there that could help you out. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't want to get into a truck with a stranger, especially not in the middle of the night at a deserted rest stop. But what choice did I have? The nearest town was miles away, and I had no other way to get there. I don't know, I stammered, trying to think of an excuse. He gave me a strange smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. Come on, it's not safe out here alone. I'm just trying to help. His words were reasonable, but there was something off about his tone, something that made me want to run. But where could I go? I was stuck. My mind raced as I tried to think of a way out. I'll just wait here, I said, forcing a smile. I've got roadside assistance. They should be here soon. His smile faded and his expression hardened. In the middle of the night? Good luck with that. You're better off coming with me. My heart pounded in my chest. I could tell he wasn't going to take no for an answer. I backed up a step, trying to put some distance between us. I'll be fine. Really? He took a step closer, and I could see the shift in his eyes, from friendly to something darker. It's not safe out here, girl. You need to come with me. I realized then that I was in real danger. I had to get away from him, but I didn't know how. He was bigger, stronger, and I was alone. My mind raced as I tried to think of a plan. I just need to grab something from my car, I said quickly, turning back toward the driver's side door. He grabbed my arm before I could move, his grip tight and painful. You're coming with me, he growled, all pretense of friendliness gone. I yanked my arm away and stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears. I knew I had to get away, but he was blocking my path to the car. I looked around, searching for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing. Don't make this harder than it has to be, he said, stepping closer. I backed up again, my foot slipping on the wet pavement. I glanced at the woods, thinking maybe I could run, but the darkness was too thick. I wouldn't get far before he caught me. Please, I said, my voice shaking. Just let me go. He didn't answer. Instead, he lunged at me, his hand reaching for my throat. I ducked and ran, sprinting toward the rest stop building. I could hear him cursing behind me as he gave chase. I burst into the building, slamming the door behind me. I knew it wouldn't hold for long, but it gave me a moment to catch my breath. I looked around, desperately searching for something, anything to defend myself with. There was nothing. The place was empty, just a dirty bathroom and a couple of vending machines. I could hear him outside, pounding on the door. I knew I had to get out of there, but I was trapped. The pounding stopped, and I held my breath, listening. It was quiet, too quiet. I didn't know where he was, and that terrified me even more. I crept to the window and peeked out, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. I had to move, had to find a way out. I pushed open the door as quietly as I could and slipped outside. The rain was pouring down, making it hard to see, but I couldn't stay there. I ran back to my car, hoping I could get inside and lock the doors before he found me. But as I reached the car, I felt a hand grab my shoulder. I screamed and twisted away, slipping on the wet ground. He was right behind me, his eyes wild with anger. "You're not getting away," he snarled, reaching for me again. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not knowing where I was going, just trying to get away. I could hear him close behind, his footsteps pounding on the pavement. I saw the truck out of the corner of my eye and made a split-second decision. I darted toward it, hoping I could find something inside to defend myself with. I yanked open the door and climbed in, slamming it shut behind me. I locked the doors and fumbled for the keys. They were in the ignition. I didn't know if I could drive the rig, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. I threw it into gear and hit the gas, the truck lurching forward. I saw him in the rearview mirror, chasing after me, but I didn't slow down. I drove until I saw the lights of the next town. I pulled into a well-lit gas station and parked the truck, my hands shaking. I called the police, and they were there within minutes. They found my car at the rest stop, but the man was gone. They searched the area, but there was no sign of him. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just me and Rob, away from everything. We drove out to a remote spot Rob knew about, deep in the woods, far from any town. It was perfect, no phone signal, no people, just us and the trees. We set up our tent, got a fire going, and started to relax as the sun dipped below the treetops. Around dusk, we heard someone coming up the trail. I tensed up a bit because we hadn't seen a single soul since we arrived. Rob, always the friendly one, waved as the guy came closer. He was tall and lanky, with a scruffy beard and a backpack that looked like it had seen better days. "Mind if I join you folks for a bit?" he asked, smiling. There was something about his smile that put me off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Rob shrugged and said, "Sure, why not? Plenty of fire to go around." The guy dropped his pack and sat down on one of the logs we pulled up around the fire. He introduced himself as Dave, said he was just passing through, doing some solo camping. We chatted for a while, mostly Rob and him, about the usual stuff, hiking trails, fishing spots, that kind of thing. But after a while, Dave's stories started to get weird. He told us about the places he'd been, how he liked to go where no one else did, places not on any map. He said he preferred it that way, being alone in the wild, where no one could find him. Rob laughed it off, but I was starting to feel uneasy. There was something in Dave's eyes, a glint that didn't match the casual tone of his voice. It started to drizzle, just a light rain, so we all huddled closer to the fire. Dave kept talking, and his stories got darker. He mentioned a time he was out in the woods and came across an old cabin, abandoned, he said. But then he started describing the things he found inside: rusted tools, a bloody mattress, and a journal filled with ramblings about someone being watched. The way he described it, with so much detail, made my skin crawl. I glanced at Rob, hoping he was getting the same bad feeling I was, but he just nodded along, looking interested. Maybe it was the beer, or maybe he didn't want to seem rude, but he wasn't picking up on the strangeness. Dave noticed me staring and turned his attention to me. "You ever feel like you're being watched out here?" he asked, leaning in a little closer. "Like there's something just beyond the trees, waiting?" I forced a smile, trying to brush it off. "Not really. It's pretty quiet out here." He grinned, that same unsettling grin from earlier. "Quiet, yeah, but not empty." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded, hoping he'd drop it. But he didn't. He kept going, talking about how the woods could hide anything, people, animals, things that didn't belong. He said you never know what you'll find if you wander far enough. Or what might find you. Rob finally picked up on my discomfort and tried to steer the conversation back to lighter topics, but Dave wasn't having it. He started asking us questions: where we were from, how long we were staying, if we told anyone where we were going. The way he asked made my stomach twist. It didn't feel like idle chatter anymore. It felt like he was trying to figure out just how alone we were out there. The rain picked up, turning into a steady downpour. Rob suggested we turn in for the night, hoping to get some sleep and maybe shake off the weird vibe. Dave didn't move, though. He just sat there, staring into the fire, like he was thinking about something. When we finally got up to go to the tent, Dave looked up and said, "You mind if I stay out here a bit longer? I'll be gone by morning." Rob hesitated but then nodded. "Sure, man. Just don't let the fire go out." We crawled into the tent, and I immediately whispered to Rob that I didn't like this guy. He shrugged it off, said Dave was probably just lonely, maybe a little strange, but harmless. I wasn't so sure. We lay there in the dark, listening to the rain drumming on the tent. I could hear the fire crackling outside and the occasional rustle as Dave moved around. I tried to sleep, but every little noise made me jump. I kept imagining Dave standing outside, watching us through the tent walls. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of footsteps. It was still dark, but the rain had let up. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving around the campsite. I nudged Rob, whispering his name, but he was out cold. I sat up, trying to see through the tent flap, but it was too dark. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard the zipper on Rob's backpack. My heart started pounding. I shook Rob harder, trying to wake him. He finally stirred, mumbling something, but I clamped my hand over his mouth, pointing to the tent flap. He went still, his eyes wide as he heard the sound too. We didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. The zipper noise stopped, and then the footsteps started again, this time heading away from the tent. I finally let out a shaky breath, but I knew we weren't safe yet. We waited a few minutes, and when we didn't hear anything else, Rob whispered that we should check it out. I didn't want to go out there, but we couldn't just sit in the tent all night, not knowing what Dave was up to. We unzipped the tent as quietly as we could and stepped out into the damp night. The fire was out, just a few glowing embers left. Dave was nowhere to be seen, but his backpack was still by the log where he'd been sitting. Rob crept over to his backpack, motioning for me to keep watch. He unzipped it, and I saw him stiffen as he looked inside. He pulled out a large hunting knife, a roll of duct tape, and a coil of rope. My blood ran cold. "We need to go," I whispered, grabbing Rob's arm. "Now!" Rob nodded, stuffing the knife into his pocket. We started packing up our things as quickly and quietly as we could. I kept glancing around, expecting Dave to jump out of the shadows at any moment. Just as we were about to leave, we heard a branch snap behind us. We froze, turning slowly toward the sound. Dave was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us. His expression was blank, but there was something in his eyes that terrified me. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice calm, too calm. Rob stepped forward, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, something came up. We've got to head back." Dave didn't move. He just stood there, blocking our way out. I could see his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "It's not safe to travel at night," he said, his voice low. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. Rob kept his voice steady, but I could tell he was scared too. "We'll be fine," We're used to it. Dave tilted his head, like he was considering something. Then he stepped aside, just enough to let us pass. If you say so. We didn't wait. We grabbed our stuff and hurried past him, not looking back. I kept expecting him to jump at us, but he just stood there, watching as we disappeared down the trail. We walked fast, almost running, not saying a word. I could still feel Dave's eyes on us, even though we were deep into the woods. The rain started up again, but we didn't stop. We just wanted to get as far away from him as possible. When we finally reached the car, we threw our stuff in the back and took off, not caring that we left most of our campsite behind. It wasn't until we were miles down the road that we finally started to breathe again. Rob kept glancing in the rearview mirror, like he expected Dave to be following us. I didn't say anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something terrible. When I pulled into the motel parking lot, it was already past midnight. I had been driving for hours, just trying to make it through one more day on the road. I didn't plan on stopping, but the rain was coming down so hard I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. The neon sign for the motel flickered weakly, and I decided it was better to spend the night there than risk driving any further. The place was run down, paint peeling off the walls and a couple of the windows boarded up. There were only a few cars in the lot, and the office light was dim. I walked in, and a guy at the desk barely looked up from his magazine. He was an older man, with graying hair and a face that looked like it had seen better days. I asked for a room, and he handed me a key without much of a word. Room 12. The room was as bad as I expected. The carpet was stained, the bed looked lumpy, and the TV was one of those old boxy ones from the 90s. I didn't care, though. I was too tired to care. I tossed my bag on the floor and collapsed onto the bed. The rain pounded against the window, and the wind howled outside. I figured I'd just sleep through the night and leave early in the morning. I must have dozed off pretty quickly, but it didn't feel like I had been asleep for long when I woke up. I didn't wake up gradually. It was like my brain just flipped on all at once. I couldn't move. My arms, my legs, they were tied to the bed. I tried to scream, but something was in my mouth, a gag, tight and rough against my skin. Panic hit me like a truck. I thrashed as hard as I could, but the ropes didn't budge. They tied me down tight. The room was dark except for the faint light coming through the window. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out. How the hell did this happen? I'd locked the door, I was sure of it. I tried to remember if I heard anything before I blacked out, but my mind was a blank. It was like I'd gone to sleep and woken up in someone else's nightmare. I lay there, listening, trying to hear if anyone else was in the room. But it was quiet, dead quiet except for the rain. I started breathing harder, thinking maybe I could make enough noise to get someone's attention. I tried to yell through the gag, but it just came out as muffled groans. I pulled at the ropes again, but they were solid. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. I didn't know how long I was like that, but it felt like forever. My muscles were burning from struggling, and sweat was running down my face. I was terrified someone would walk in any minute, but at the same time, I was terrified they wouldn't. I wanted to believe it was some kind of prank, some sick joke, but deep down I knew it wasn't. After what felt like hours, I heard footsteps outside. They were slow and deliberate, getting closer and closer. My heart pounded so hard it was the only thing I could hear. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, and I heard the doorknob turn. I squeezed my eyes shut, pretending to be asleep, hoping maybe they'd just leave me alone. The door creaked open, and I felt someone step into the room. They moved quietly, but I could feel their presence. The air felt heavy, like something terrible was about to happen. I didn't dare open my eyes, but I could hear them moving around, hear their breathing. I waited for them to do something, say something, touch me, anything, but they didn't. They just stood there, watching me. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I opened my eyes just a crack, enough to see a shadowy figure standing by the bed. They were tall, their face hidden in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and I closed my eyes again, praying they didn't notice. But they did. I felt a hand grab my arm, squeezing tight. My eyes flew open, and I saw them leaning over me. Their face was so close I could feel their breath on my skin. They didn't say anything, just stared at me with cold, empty eyes. I tried to pull away, but they held me down, pressing me into the mattress. Then they spoke, their voice low and chilling. "You shouldn't have stopped here." My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of it. I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but the gag kept me silent. The figure reached into their pocket and pulled out something shiny, a knife. My blood ran cold as they held it up, letting the dim light glint off the blade. They didn't use it, though. They just hovered over me for what felt like an eternity, as if they were deciding whether to end it right there. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they pulled back. They cut the ropes around my wrists and ankles, not all at once, but slowly, like they wanted me to know they were in control. My limbs felt like jelly, too weak to fight back. Once I was free, they stepped back, letting me sit up. I ripped the gag from my mouth, gasping for air, but before I could do anything, they grabbed my face, forcing me to look at them. "If you want to live, you'll leave. Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I stumbled off the bed, almost falling as my legs gave out beneath me. The figure just stood there, watching me struggle to get to the door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the doorknob. When I finally managed to open it, I bolted out of the room, not daring to look back. The motel was dead silent, not a single light on except for the dim glow from the office. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before I finally got the door open. I jumped in, slammed the door shut, and locked it, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I sat there for a second, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what just happened. But I couldn't. The only thing I knew for sure was that I had to get the hell out of there. I turned the key, the engine sputtering to life, and floored it out of the parking lot. As I drove down the dark, empty road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing, just the rain pouring down in sheets. I kept driving, my mind racing with questions I didn't have answers to. I didn't stop until I was miles away, at a gas station that looked halfway decent. I parked under the bright lights, my hands still shaking. I sat there, staring out into the rain, trying to calm down. But I couldn't stop thinking about that figure in the motel room, those cold eyes watching me. I knew I couldn't go to the police. What would I even say? That I checked into a motel and woke up tied to a bed with no memory of how it happened? That the other guests were in on it? It sounded insane, like something out of a horror movie. But it was real. Too real. Tim and I had been looking forward to the weekend at the cabin for weeks. We needed a break from the city, from work, from everything. The place was as remote as it gets, no phone signal, no Wi-Fi, just trees and silence all around. It was perfect. The first day was great. We hiked, cooked over the fire, and spent the evening on the porch with nothing but the sounds of the forest around us. The air was cool and crisp, and the stars were brighter than I'd ever seen. By the time we went to bed, we were both exhausted, and I fell asleep almost as soon as my head hit the pillow. I'm not sure what woke me up that night. I just remember lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The only sound was Tim's slow, steady breathing next to me. I figured it was just the unfamiliarity of the place making me restless. I turned over and tried to get comfortable, but that's when I heard it, the faintest creak, like wood settling, but more deliberate. I froze, listening. It was quiet for a while, and I started to think I'd imagined it. But then I heard it again, a soft, careful step. It was coming from above us, from the roof. My heart started to race. I nudged Tim, but he just mumbled something and rolled over. I didn't want to wake him up over nothing, so I lay there, straining to hear. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like someone was trying not to be heard. They moved across the roof, then stopped right above us. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, but after a few minutes, everything went silent again. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a raccoon or something. But deep down, I didn't really believe it. The next morning, I mentioned it to Tim. He shrugged it off, saying it was probably nothing. These old cabins make all kinds of noises, he said. I wanted to believe him, so I tried to put it out of my mind. We spent the day exploring more of the woods, and by the time we got back, I had almost forgotten about the night before. But when the sun went down, and the shadows started creeping in, I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. We were sitting by the fire when we heard it again, another creak, this time from the porch. It was subtle, like the sound of a board bending under weight. I looked at Tim, and I could see that he heard it too. He got up, grabbed the flashlight, and opened the door to check outside. The beam of light swept across the porch, but there was nothing there. See? Just the wind or something, he said, trying to sound casual. But I could tell he was spooked too. We went back inside, locking the door behind us. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread, but it clung to me. I kept looking around, expecting to see something move in the shadows. Tim tried to distract me with a card game, but I couldn't focus. I kept hearing little noises, the crackling of the fire, the creak of the floorboards, every little sound seemed magnified. It was around midnight when things started getting weird. I was in the kitchen, grabbing some water, when I heard a thud from the living room. I rushed back and saw that one of the chairs had fallen over. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. "Did you do that?" I asked Tim, but he was just as confused as I was. We set the chair back up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Tim tried to reassure me, saying it was just the old house settling, but I could see he was getting nervous too. The tension was thick in the air, and neither of us knew what to do. Then, just as we were about to head to bed, we heard it again, footsteps, but this time, they were inside the house. They were faint, like someone was trying to move quietly. We stood there, frozen, listening as they crept down the hallway toward us. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Tim grabbed the poker from the fireplace, holding it like a weapon. We slowly made our way down the hall, the sound of the footsteps growing louder. They stopped just as we reached the bedroom door. Tim pushed it open, and we both jumped as the door creaked on its hinges. But there was nothing there, just an empty room, exactly as we'd left it. We checked every corner of the house, but there was no sign of anyone. No open windows, no broken locks, nothing. But the feeling of being watched was so strong it made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the thought that whoever or whatever was making those sounds was still there, just out of sight. Tim suggested we leave, but it was the middle of the night, and the storm outside had picked up. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind howled through the trees. The idea of driving in that weather didn't seem any safer than staying put. We decided to wait it out until morning. We barricaded ourselves in the living room, moving the couch in front of the door. Tim kept the poker close by, and I had a kitchen knife in my hand, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. We sat there in the dim light of the dying fire, barely speaking, just listening. The footsteps started again, this time coming from the roof. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if someone was circling the house. I clenched the knife so hard my knuckles turned white. Tim's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. The footsteps moved to the window, then stopped. I could feel my heart in my throat as I stared at the dark glass, half expecting a face to appear. But there was nothing, just the rain pouring down outside. The minutes dragged on, and the silence was almost worse than the noises. We were trapped, and there was nothing we could do but wait. Just when I thought the worst was over, there was a loud bang from the back door. It sounded like something heavy had been thrown against it. Tim jumped up, his grip tightening on the poker. We both stared at the door, waiting for it to burst open. But it didn't. Instead, we heard the footsteps retreating, slowly moving away from the house. We didn't move for what felt like hours, just sat there, listening to the storm and the fading sounds of footsteps. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off. When I woke up, it was morning. The storm had passed, and the sun was shining through the windows. We didn't waste any time packing up. Neither of us wanted to spend another minute in that cabin. As we loaded the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that someone or something was still out there, hiding in the trees. We drove away, leaving the cabin and the nightmare behind us. I was driving home late one night, and the storm was so bad that I could barely see the road in front of me. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wipers couldn't keep up. I was tense, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to stay focused. I had a long drive ahead of me, and the weather wasn't making it any easier. I almost didn't see him at first. He was standing on the side of the road, drenched, with his thumb out. I don't know what made me stop. Maybe it was the fact that he looked so miserable out there in the rain, or maybe I just wanted someone to talk to. Either way, I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" I asked. He nodded, his face half hidden by the hood of his jacket. He looked like he was in his late 30s, maybe early 40s. His clothes were soaked, and he was shivering. I felt bad for him, standing out there in the storm, so I unlocked the door and he got in. "Thanks, man," he said, his voice low and rough. "I've been out here for hours." "No problem," I replied. "Where are you headed?" He shrugged. "Just need to get to the next town. Anywhere's better than out here." I nodded and started driving again. The rain was still pouring down, and the road was slick. I kept my eyes on the road, but I couldn't help glancing over at him every now and then. He didn't say much, just sat there, staring out the window. Something about him made me uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on it. We drove in silence for a while. The only sound was the rain pounding against the car. I tried to make small talk to break the tension. "Crazy weather, huh?" I said, forcing a smile. "Yeah," he replied, not looking at me. "Crazy." After that, we fell silent again. I was starting to regret picking him up. The air in the car felt heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I pushed the thought aside and kept driving. After a few miles, he finally spoke again. "You live around here?" "Not too far," I answered. Just passing through, though. He nodded, and then he said something that sent a chill down my spine. You've got a nice house. Out in the country, right? Big yard, lots of trees. I glanced at him, my heart skipping a beat. How do you know that? He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just a guess. My grip on the wheel tightened. I didn't like this. Not one bit. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a coincidence, but the way he said it, it didn't feel right. We drove on, and I could feel his eyes on me, watching me. The rain was still pouring down, and the road seemed to stretch on forever. I just wanted to get to the next town, drop him off, and be done with it. You've got a dog, too, he said suddenly. Big, black one. Likes to bark at strangers. My blood ran cold. There was no way he could know that. I hadn't mentioned it, and my house was way off the beaten path. Nobody just guessed that kind of thing. I tried to keep my voice steady. How do you know about my dog? He turned to me, and the look in his eyes made my stomach churn. I've been by your place a few times. Nice spot you got there. Real quiet. Panic started to rise in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I was in the middle of nowhere with a man who seemed to know way too much about me. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but there was nothing. Just a storm and the empty road. I think you should get out, I said, my voice shaking. He didn't move. Just stared at me with that same cold smile. Why would I do that? We're just getting to know each other. My heart was pounding in my chest. I needed to get rid of him, but I couldn't just stop in the middle of the storm. I had to keep driving, had to get to a place with people, somewhere safe. He leaned back in his seat, still watching me. You know, I've been thinking about moving out to the country. A place like yours would be perfect. Maybe I'll pay you a visit sometime. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the wet road. Get out. I shouted. He just sat there for a moment, then slowly opened the door. All right, he said, stepping out into the rain. But I'll see you around. Count on it. I didn't wait for him to close the door. I hit the gas and sped off, my hands trembling on the wheel. I drove as fast as I could, my mind racing. Who was he? How did he know so much about me? And what did he want? I didn't stop until I reached the next town. I pulled into a gas station, my heart still pounding. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm down, but the fear wouldn't go away. I knew I'd never forget that man's face, or the way he looked at me. I got home later that night, but I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about what he'd said, about him knowing where I lived. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept expecting to see him standing outside my window. It's been weeks now, and I still can't shake the feeling that he's out there, watching me. I've changed my locks, got a security system, even bought a gun. But none of it makes me feel any safer. Every time I drive down that road, I think about him, standing there in the rain, and I wonder if he's waiting for me. I can't shake the feeling that it's only a matter of time before he shows up again. And when he does, I don't know what I'll do. I was working late at the funeral home that night, trying to finish up some paperwork I'd been putting off all week. It was just after 9, and the place was quiet. Too quiet, really. The kind of quiet that makes you notice every little sound. The storm outside wasn't helping either. The rain was pounding against the windows, and the wind howled like something out of a bad horror movie. I'd been in the business long enough to get used to the eerie atmosphere that comes with the job. You don't think too much about what's going on around you, especially after hours. But that night, something felt different. It wasn't just the storm or the late hour. There was a tension in the air, something that made my skin crawl a little more than usual. I was at my desk in the office, going over some files, when I heard it. A faint noise coming from down the hall, near the embalming room. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, or maybe the wind pushing something around outside. But then I heard it again. It was like a soft thud, followed by a scraping sound. I froze, listening. My first thought was that maybe an animal had gotten inside. It wouldn't be the first time a stray cat or raccoon found its way in during a storm. But this sounded different, more deliberate, like someone moving around. I shook my head, telling myself I was being paranoid. The funeral home had good security, and no one would break in here of all places. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. The noise kept coming, slow and steady, like something or someone was in there. I finally stood up, my heart beating a little faster than I liked. I grabbed a flashlight from the desk drawer and headed down the hallway. The place was dark, except for the occasional flash of lightning that lit up the windows. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the hallway was the only other sound, and it did nothing to ease my nerves. I reached the door to the embalming room and paused, listening. The noise had stopped, but the silence didn't feel right. I took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the cold, sterile room. Everything looked normal at first glance, but then I noticed something out of place. One of the metal tables had been moved, just slightly, but enough that I could tell. And there was something else, a faint smell, like chemicals, but not the ones we used. I stepped further into the room, my hands trembling just a little. The beam of the flashlight swept over the floor, and that's when I saw it. A small, dark stain near the corner of the table. Blood. Fresh, from the looks of it. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right at all. I knew I should have called the police right then and there, but I couldn't make myself do it. Something about the situation made me feel like I needed to know what was going on before I brought anyone else into it. I followed the trail of blood with the flashlight, and it led me to the storage cabinets at the back of the room. The doors were slightly ajar, and I could see something inside. Something that didn't belong there. With my heart pounding in my ears, I opened the cabinet door wider, and there it was, a duffel bag, unzipped, with something sticking out. I leaned in closer, shining the light on it. My stomach turned when I realized what I was looking at. Drugs. Bags of white powder, stuffed into the duffel, hidden among the supplies. This wasn't just someone breaking in. This was something much worse. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. I'd heard stories about places like this being used for shady deals, but I never thought it would happen here, in my funeral home. I turned to leave, to get out of there and call the cops, but before I could take a step, I heard the door creak behind me. I spun around, and there he was, a man, tall, with a scar running down the side of his face. He was holding a gun, pointing it right at me. "Don't move," he said, his voice cold and steady. "You weren't supposed to find this." I froze, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't know what to say, what to do. He stepped closer, and I could see the tension in his eyes, the way his hand gripped the gun. He was desperate, and that made him even more dangerous. "Look, I didn't see anything," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll just leave, and you can do whatever you need to do." He didn't lower the gun. "Too late for that," he said. "You're involved now." I tried to think of a way out, but my mind was blank. The storm outside was still raging, the wind howling louder than ever. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, like I was trapped with no way out. Then, in a split second, I made a decision. I wasn't going to just stand there and let him do whatever he was planning. I had to do something, anything, to get out of there alive. I lunged forward, swinging the flashlight as hard as I could. It connected with his arm, and the gun went off, the sound deafening in the small room. Pain shot through my shoulder, but I didn't stop. I pushed him back, knocking him off balance. He stumbled, and I took my chance, running for the door. I didn't look back as I tore down the hallway, my shoulder throbbing with pain. I could hear him shouting, cursing, but I didn't stop. I burst out into the storm, the rain soaking me instantly, but I didn't care. I just kept running. I made it to my car, fumbling with the keys, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I jumped in and locked the doors, my heart racing. I glanced back at the funeral home, but there was no sign of him. I didn't wait to find out if he was coming after me. I started the car and sped off, the tires slipping on the wet pavement. I drove straight to the police station, not stopping until I was inside, telling them everything. They took me seriously, especially when they saw the blood on my shirt and the panic in my eyes. They went to the funeral home, but by the time they got there, the man was gone. The drugs were still there, though, and that was enough to start an investigation. I don't know if they ever caught him, and part of me doesn't want to know. I haven't been back to the funeral home since that night. I left my job, moved to another town, trying to put it all behind me. But the memory still haunts me, the thought of how close I came to not making it out alive. We rented a lake house for the weekend, just a group of friends looking to unwind. The place was old, kind of creaky, but it had this charm that we all liked. It was set deep in the woods, right by the water. The kind of place you don't really find unless you're looking for it. We were excited, ready to relax and enjoy the break. The weather was perfect, blue skies, warm sun, and just a slight breeze coming off the lake. There were 6 of us, me, Emma, my boyfriend Tom, my best friend Lucy, her boyfriend Craig, and our other friends, Mike and Sarah. We'd been friends for years, so it felt natural to spend a weekend like this together. We planned to do all the usual stuff, swimming, fishing, maybe a little hiking, and definitely some drinking. The first day was great. We settled in, unpacked, and started a fire by the lake as the sun began to set. We laughed a lot, told old stories, and roasted marshmallows. Everything felt normal, even fun. We all stayed up late, talking about nothing and everything, just enjoying each other's company. It wasn't until the next morning that things started to feel off. We woke up to find that Mike wasn't in his room. We thought maybe he'd gone for a run. He was always up early, and he liked to stay active. But when we called his phone, it just rang and rang. We searched around the house, checked the dock by the lake, and even walked up the road a bit, but there was no sign of him. We didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he'd gone for a swim or decided to explore the woods on his own. But as the day went on and he still didn't show up, we started to worry. By late afternoon, we were all getting anxious. It wasn't like Mike to just disappear. He was responsible, the kind of guy who'd leave a note if he was going somewhere. That evening, we all sat around the living room, trying to figure out what to do. The sun had gone down, and the darkness seemed thicker than usual, pressing against the windows. Sarah was the first to suggest calling the police, but Craig said we should wait until morning. He figured Mike would come back on his own. But then Lucy went missing. She'd said she was going to get some air, just stepping out onto the porch for a minute. None of us noticed she was gone until we realized it had been too long. When we went out to look for her, she wasn't there. Her phone was still in the house, lying on the coffee table. That's when panic really set in. We split up to search, but deep down, I think we all knew it was a bad idea. The woods were dense, the lake still and quiet, and every sound made my heart race. We shouted her name over and over, but there was nothing. It was like she'd just vanished into thin air. When we regrouped back at the house, the tension was thick. No one knew what to say. Sarah was crying, and Tom tried to comfort her, but it was clear he was scared too. Craig kept pacing, muttering to himself. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the walls were closing in on us. Then Craig said he was going to find them, no matter what. He grabbed a flashlight and headed out, telling us to stay put. We tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen. He said he couldn't just sit there while his girlfriend was missing. We watched him disappear into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight bouncing through the trees. He didn't come back. Hours passed, but they felt like days. The house felt colder, emptier. We didn't dare go outside again. We just sat there, waiting, hoping someone would walk through the door, but no one did. Tom kept saying we should have left as soon as Mike went missing, that we'd made a mistake staying there. The next morning, the three of us, me, Tom, and Sarah, decided we couldn't wait any longer. We needed to get out of there, find help, do something. But when we went outside to the car, the tires were slashed. Every single one. There was no way to drive out, and the nearest town was miles away. That's when I knew we were being hunted. Someone was out there, watching us, waiting for the right moment. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt sick, dizzy. Tom tried to keep us calm, said we'd walk to town, that we'd stick together and be safe. But I could see the fear in his eyes. We grabbed whatever we could carry, water, some snacks, a couple of flashlights, and started walking. The woods were so quiet, too quiet, like even the birds and animals were hiding. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something, someone, following us. But there was nothing, just the rustling of leaves and the crunch of twigs under our feet. Sarah was struggling to keep up, so we slowed down, but that just made the walk feel even longer. Every step felt like it could be our last. My mind was racing, imagining all the terrible things that could happen. I kept thinking about Mike, Lucy, and Craig, wondering where they were, if they were even alive. We didn't get far before Sarah started lagging behind again. Tom and I stopped to wait for her, but when we turned around, she was gone. Just gone, like she'd been swallowed up by the woods. There was no sound, no sign of struggle, nothing. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body felt frozen, rooted to the spot. Tom grabbed my hand, pulling me along, telling me we had to keep moving. I didn't argue. I couldn't. All I could think about was getting away, finding safety, but the woods felt endless. The trees all looked the same, and I couldn't tell if we were making progress or just going in circles. Then, out of nowhere, Tom stopped. I asked him what was wrong, but he didn't answer. He just stood there, staring ahead. I followed his gaze and saw it, a figure in the distance, standing among the trees. It was too far away to make out any details, but I knew it wasn't one of our friends. Tom whispered that we needed to move quietly, that we couldn't let them see us. We started backing away, trying to be as silent as possible, but the figure began moving towards us, slowly at first, then picking up speed. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. We turned and ran, as fast as we could, branches slapping against our faces, our feet stumbling over roots and rocks. I could hear footsteps behind us, getting closer, and I pushed myself to run faster, even though my legs felt like they were on fire. I don't know how long we ran before we broke through the trees and saw the road. It was empty, just a strip of asphalt cutting through the wilderness, but it felt like a lifeline. We bolted towards it, not caring if the figure was still behind us or not. All I wanted was to get out of those woods. A car came around the bend just as we reached the road. We flagged it down, desperate, and the driver, a middle-aged man who looked as terrified as we felt, let us in. We didn't explain, didn't say anything. We just begged him to drive, and he did, speeding away from that place as fast as he could. Tom and I never found out what happened to the others. The police searched the lake house, the woods, everything, but there was no trace of Mike, Lucy, Craig, or Sarah. It was like they'd been erased from existence. No one believed our story, not really. They thought we'd gotten lost, panicked, but I know what happened. Someone out there was picking us off, one by one. I haven't gone camping since. I can't. When we moved to the farmhouse, it felt like a new beginning. The kind of fresh start people talk about but rarely get. I was tired of the city, the noise, the stress. Alex felt the same. We found the place by chance, a listing online with a price too good to pass up. It was old, but it had character, and the land around it was beautiful, endless fields and a thick line of trees in the distance. It was peaceful. The first few days were spent unpacking, getting settled. The house was bigger than we were used to, with creaky floors and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. But it was ours. We spent our evenings sitting on the porch, watching the sun set behind the trees, talking about all the things we wanted to do with the place. We felt good about the decision, even excited. Then we found the barn. It was set back from the house, almost hidden by the overgrown grass and weeds. I'm not sure how we missed it at first. Maybe we just didn't notice it in our excitement. But one afternoon, while we were exploring the property, there it was, old, weathered wood with a roof that sagged in the middle, like it had been forgotten for years. There was something about it that made me uneasy, but I didn't say anything. Alex was already walking toward it, curious. The door was heavy, stuck in place from years of disuse, but we managed to push it open. The smell hit us first, musty, damp, like the air inside hadn't moved in decades. The light filtered in through the gaps in the wood, casting strange shadows on the dirt floor. There wasn't much inside, just some old farming equipment, rusted and covered in cobwebs. But then Alex noticed the markings. They were carved into the wood, low to the ground, almost like someone had tried to hide them. They weren't like anything I'd ever seen, just strange symbols, jagged lines that didn't seem to make any sense. Alex tried to brush it off, said it was probably just kids messing around years ago, but I wasn't so sure. There was something about them that felt wrong. We didn't talk about the barn after that. We were busy with other things, fixing up the house, getting the place in order. But at night, I'd lie in bed thinking about those markings, wondering what they meant, who had put them there. It was like a dark cloud hanging over our new beginning, something I couldn't shake. A few nights later, I woke up to a sound outside. It was faint, like something rustling in the grass. I looked over at Alex, but he was still asleep. I didn't want to wake him, so I got up quietly and went to the window. The moon was bright, lighting up the yard, but there was nothing there. Just the wind moving through the trees. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't fall back asleep. The next morning, we found something strange. In the yard, near the barn, the grass was flattened in a perfect circle, like something heavy had been sitting there. There were no tracks leading to it or away from it, just that one spot, pressed down like it had been done deliberately. Alex tried to laugh it off, said it was probably just animals, but I could tell he was unnerved too. We decided to investigate the barn again, this time during the day. The light was better, and we could see more of the markings. They covered more of the walls than we'd realized, stretching up higher than we thought. Alex brought out his phone and took some pictures, saying he'd look them up later, try to figure out what they meant. But I didn't want to know. I just wanted to forget about it, pretend we hadn't seen anything. That night, the noises outside got louder. It wasn't just rustling this time, it was footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the house. I shook Alex awake, and we both listened, holding our breath. The footsteps circled the house, then stopped. We didn't move, didn't even breathe, until we heard them again, this time moving away, back toward the barn. The next morning, we found more strange things. The front door was unlocked, even though I knew I'd locked it before bed. In the kitchen, one of the chairs was turned over, like someone had knocked it down. But nothing was missing. It was like someone had been there, but they hadn't taken anything. Just moved things around. Alex tried to stay calm, but I could tell he was scared. We both were. We didn't know what was happening, but it felt like we were being watched, like someone was playing a game with us. We decided to call the police, but when they came out, they didn't find anything. They looked around, asked some questions, but there was nothing they could do. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone being there. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, they were louder, more insistent, like whoever it was wanted us to know they were there. Alex grabbed a flashlight and said he was going out there, but I begged him not to. I had this feeling, deep in my gut, that something terrible would happen if he went outside. So we stayed in, sitting in the dark, listening to those footsteps until they finally stopped. The next day, we decided we had to do something. We couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever was happening to get worse. So we went back to the barn, determined to figure out what those markings meant. Alex had done some research, and he said they were similar to symbols used by old cults, but he couldn't find an exact match. As we were looking around, we heard something whispering, low and indistinct, like it was coming from all around us. We froze, and the whispering stopped. Then, from the back of the barn, we saw a shadow move. It was quick, almost too quick to catch, but we both saw it. There was someone in there with us. We ran out, not daring to look back. When we got to the house, we locked all the doors and windows, grabbed our things, and got in the car. We didn't care about anything else, we just wanted to get out of there. As we drove away, I looked back at the barn, and I swear I saw someone standing in the doorway, watching us. We didn't go back. We called the realtor and told them we couldn't stay there, that something was wrong with the place. They didn't ask questions, just said they put it back on the market. We found a new place in town, far away from the farmhouse, and tried to put the whole thing behind us. But I still think about it, especially at night. I can't get those markings out of my head, can't stop wondering who was in that barn with us, and what they wanted. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I hear footsteps outside the window. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know we were never really alone out there. I decided to go camping to clear my head. It was supposed to be a simple, relaxing weekend away from everything. I packed up my gear, drove out to a national park I'd heard was quiet and secluded, and found what seemed like the perfect spot. It was a small clearing surrounded by trees, right next to a gentle stream. It felt peaceful and far from the hustle and bustle of daily life. I set up my tent, made a small campfire, and cooked a simple meal. The sky was clear, and the stars were brilliant, something I hadn't seen in a long time. It was everything I'd hoped for, a place where I could just be alone with my thoughts. As night fell, the forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant sound of the stream. I settled into my tent, listening to the soothing sounds of the forest. I was about to drift off to sleep when I heard a faint sound. It was so quiet at first that I thought I might have imagined it, but then I heard it again, someone moving around outside. I held still, trying to pinpoint the sound. It was closer than I expected, coming from somewhere nearby. I got out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent just a bit. The darkness outside was thick, and the only light was from my dying campfire. I didn't see anyone, but I could hear the sounds more clearly now, footsteps crunching on the ground and the occasional clink of metal. It sounded like someone was setting up camp not too far from where I was. I quietly stepped outside, trying to see if I could spot whoever was there. The forest was silent again, except for the sounds of the stream and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I looked around but saw no one. The footsteps had stopped, but I could still sense that I wasn't alone. I went back into my tent, feeling uneasy. I tried to convince myself that it was probably just another camper who had arrived late and was setting up quietly. But the sound of footsteps had been too deliberate, too close. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening intently, but the night seemed to stretch on forever. A few hours later, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, and I could definitely tell that someone was moving around very close to my campsite. I didn't want to confront anyone directly in case it was someone who might be dangerous, so I decided to wait and see if I could figure out what was going on. I waited until I was sure the person was near my tent. I slowly unzipped the tent and peered outside. The campfire was nearly out, casting faint shadows. I saw movement near the edge of the clearing. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the movement. I saw someone quickly duck behind a tree. My heart was racing. I didn't know who this person was or what they wanted. I felt trapped in my own campsite, unable to call for help because there was no cell service out here. I considered packing up and leaving, but I didn't want to make any sudden movements that might attract attention. The person didn't come any closer, but I could hear them shuffling around and occasionally whispering. I listened carefully and heard the sounds of equipment being moved, metal clinking, a rope dragging through the dirt. I had no idea what they were doing, but it was clear they weren't just another camper who had arrived late. I decided to take a risk. I carefully crawled out of my tent and moved silently toward the edge of the clearing. I could see a shadow moving around the area where I had heard the noises coming from. I crept closer and saw a figure setting up a makeshift campsite. It was a man, dressed in dark clothing, and he seemed to be preparing something, maybe a tent or a shelter. I could barely make out what he was doing, but I could see enough to know that he was not there to enjoy a peaceful camping trip. I felt a chill run down my spine. I needed to get out of there, but I also needed to find out if he had noticed me. I quietly made my way back to my tent. I had to be very careful not to make any noise that might give me away. I could still hear the man rustling around outside. I quickly decided to pack up my gear and leave. I knew it wasn't safe to stay, especially if I had stumbled upon someone who was up to no good. I packed everything as quickly and quietly as I could, trying not to make any noise that might attract attention. As I worked, I could hear the man's footsteps coming closer, like he was patrolling the area. My anxiety grew with every sound. I had to get out of there before he discovered I was still around. Just as I finished packing up, I heard a loud crash from the direction of the man's campsite. It sounded like he had knocked something over or had a sudden outburst. I took that as my chance to leave. I grabbed my flashlight, made sure everything was packed, and carefully made my way back to my car. I didn't look back as I drove away, my heart pounding in my chest. I was grateful to get out of there without any confrontation. I drove straight to the nearest town, where I found a small motel and checked in for the night. I was exhausted, but the adrenaline kept me awake. The next morning, I called the park ranger station and reported what had happened. I wasn't sure if they would take it seriously, but I gave them all the details I could remember. They assured me they would send someone to check the area. I never went back to that campsite. I'm not sure what that man was planning, but I'm glad I left before finding out. The whole experience left me shaken, and I've been much more cautious about where I choose to camp since then. Sometimes, I still think about that night and wonder what would have happened if I had stayed or if I had been caught by surprise. Camping was supposed to be a way to escape the everyday stresses of life, but it turned into a nightmare I never expected. My car broke down on a lonely road. It was getting dark, and there were no other cars around. I saw a light from a house not too far away and decided to walk there for help. I hoped someone could give me a ride or let me use their phone. I had no cell signal, and it was starting to get cold. The house looked old and a bit run down, but the lights were on. I knocked on the door, and a man in his 50s opened it. He had a tired look on his face and asked what I wanted. I explained my situation, and he hesitated but then invited me in. He said I could use the phone to call for a tow truck. Inside, the house smelled musty, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been changed in decades. He led me to the living room and handed me a phone. As I dialed, I noticed a woman in the kitchen, watching me closely. She seemed nervous. The phone rang, but no one answered. I tried again, still nothing. The man said the phone lines were unreliable out here. He offered me a drink, but I declined. I asked if he could give me a ride to the nearest town. He said it was too far, and his truck was out of gas. Something felt off, but I had no other options. He suggested I stay the night and leave in the morning. I didn't like the idea, but it was getting late. He showed me to a small room with a single bed. The window was nailed shut, which made me uneasy. I sat on the bed and tried to think of another plan. The house was eerily quiet. After a while, I heard whispers coming from the hallway. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded tense. I decided to peek out. The man and woman were talking in hushed voices near the stairs. They seemed to be arguing. I stepped back into the room and closed the door softly. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I needed to get out of there. I quietly opened the door and crept down the hallway. I saw another door slightly open and looked inside. There was a young girl, maybe 10 years old, sitting on the floor. She had a scared look on her face. I asked her if she was okay. She shook her head and whispered that I needed to leave. She said her parents weren't what they seemed. My heart pounded as I heard footsteps approaching. I quickly closed the door and hurried back to my room. I had to find a way out, fast. The house was dark, and I didn't want to turn on any lights. I looked for something to defend myself with and found a heavy lamp. I picked it up and made my way to the front door. It was locked, and the key was missing. Panic set in as I searched for another exit. I remembered the back door and headed towards the kitchen. The woman was there, blocking the way. She asked what I was doing, and I lied, saying I needed some air. She didn't believe me and started yelling for her husband. I bolted past her and ran to the back door. It was also locked. I could hear them both coming now, shouting angrily. I ran to the basement door and flung it open. I didn't want to go down there, but I had no choice. I descended the creaky steps and found myself in a dimly lit basement. There were old tools and boxes everywhere. I hid behind a stack of boxes, trying to calm my breathing. They were searching the house for me, their footsteps echoing above. I had to find another way out. I spotted a small window near the ceiling. It looked just big enough for me to squeeze through. I climbed up and struggled to open the window. It finally gave way, and I crawled out into the cold night air. I ran towards the woods, not looking back. My heart was racing, and I felt a surge of relief when I reached the trees. I kept running, trying to put as much distance between me and the house as possible. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights in the distance. A car was coming down a dirt road. I flagged it down, and the driver, an older man, stopped. I quickly explained what happened, and he let me in. He said he'd take me to the nearest town. As we drove away, I glanced back at the dark woods. I didn't know what those people were hiding, but I was glad to be far from them. The man dropped me off at a diner, and I called for a tow truck. I never wanted to see that place again. I got my car fixed and drove home, still shaken by the night's events. I couldn't stop thinking about that little girl. I hoped she was okay. I need to share what happened during our family vacation. It started off as a regular trip to a remote cabin we had rented for the summer. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, but it quickly turned into a nightmare. We arrived at the cabin in the early afternoon. It was isolated, surrounded by thick woods. The place was charming with its rustic look, and the view of the lake was beautiful. My wife, Sarah, and our 2 kids, Lily and Jake, were excited. We unloaded the car and settled in. The first couple of days were great. We hiked, fished, and spent evenings by the campfire. Everything seemed perfect until I noticed something odd. It was on the 3rd night. I had gone out to check the grill because the kids wanted to roast marshmallows. As I walked around the cabin, I saw something unusual. There was a small, dark spot on one of the trees close to the cabin. It looked like someone had scratched the bark, but I thought nothing of it. I assumed it was just a stray mark from a previous renter or perhaps an animal. Later that night, I heard a noise outside. It was a faint rustling sound. I went outside with a flashlight but found nothing. I shrugged it off as the wind or an animal. I didn't mention it to Sarah. I didn't want to worry her. The next morning, I saw more marks on the trees. They were fresh, and the scratches seemed to be forming a pattern, almost like an arrow pointing towards the cabin. This unsettled me, but I didn't want to alarm my family. I decided to keep an eye on things. That night, while everyone was asleep, I heard the sound again. This time, it was closer. I grabbed the flashlight and went outside. I looked around the cabin and noticed something in the shadows, a figure darting between the trees. My heart raced, but I couldn't see clearly enough to make out who it was. I went back inside and locked all the doors and windows. I decided to wait and see if anything else happened. I felt like someone was watching us. The following day, I found more signs of disturbance. It looked like someone had been near the cabin during the night. I told Sarah about my concerns. She was worried but thought it was just my imagination. I couldn't blame her for thinking that. I tried to stay calm for the sake of the kids. We decided to go for a hike to distract ourselves. During the hike, I noticed a man watching us from a distance. He was dressed in dark clothes and appeared to be hiding behind some trees. I pointed him out to Sarah, but by the time we got closer, he was gone. Sarah thought it might be a fellow hiker, but I wasn't convinced. That night, I heard footsteps around the cabin. They were slow and deliberate. I woke Sarah and told her to stay quiet. I took a peek outside and saw the same figure again, closer to the cabin this time. I was terrified and didn't know what to do. The next morning, I found that someone had tampered with the cabin's porch lights. The bulbs were unscrewed. This made me even more anxious. I decided we should leave immediately, but Sarah insisted on staying one more night since we had already paid for the week. That night, the situation escalated. I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were louder and more aggressive. I saw the figure clearly through a gap in the curtains. It was a man with a rough face, wearing a mask. I couldn't take any chances. I woke Sarah and told her we had to leave. We packed as quickly as possible. As we were loading the car, I saw the man emerging from the woods. He was carrying what looked like a crowbar. I told Sarah to get the kids in the car while I tried to confront the man. I grabbed a baseball bat from the trunk. As I approached the man, he ran back into the woods. I didn't pursue him but made sure everyone was safe inside the car. We drove straight to the nearest town and stayed in a motel for the night. The next day, I reported the incident to the local police. They took our statement and said they would look into it, but they couldn't offer much help since there was no clear evidence of the man's identity. The police never found out who the man was, but we were able to get a refund for the remaining days at the cabin. We went home early and never returned to that cabin. The experience left us all shaken, and I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if we hadn't left when we did. I still get anxious when we go on vacation, always checking and double-checking our accommodations. The memory of that summer and the feeling of being watched will always haunt me. Tom and I decided to take a weekend trip out of the city to enjoy some quiet time. We found a cabin rental in a remote area that seemed perfect for relaxation. The drive was long but enjoyable, and the scenery was beautiful. We were looking forward to a peaceful few days away from work and stress. The first day went smoothly. We spent time hiking and exploring the area. The cabin was exactly what we had hoped for. The second day, we decided to explore a bit more and maybe find a scenic spot to have a picnic. The map showed a small trail that looked interesting, so we set out to find it. As we drove, the road became less paved and more rugged. We didn't think much of it, figuring it was just part of the adventure. We followed the directions on our GPS, but soon it started acting up. The signal was weak, and we ended up taking a wrong turn. Before we knew it, the trees around us thickened, and the road turned into a narrow, winding path. We didn't see any other cars or signs of civilization. I started to feel uneasy, but Tom kept reassuring me that we were just off the beaten path and would find our way back soon. After about an hour, we saw a small, dilapidated sign that read "Welcome to Pine Grove Community." The place looked run down, and the houses were spread out and seemed older. It was clear that this was not the scenic spot we had intended to visit. We decided to turn around and head back. That's when things started to go wrong. As we tried to retrace our route, we noticed a few people watching us from their porches and yards. Their stares were intense and made me uncomfortable. I tried to ignore it and hoped we would get out of there soon. Tom took another wrong turn, and we ended up deeper into the community. The roads were getting narrower, and the houses more isolated. I could see people moving around in the distance, but no one came up to us or offered assistance. The sense of unease grew as we saw a few locals gathered near a rundown building. They watched us closely, and I noticed some of them whispering to each other. I told Tom we should stop and ask for directions, but he seemed more focused on finding a way out quickly. We stopped at a small general store, hoping to get some help. Inside, the store was dimly lit and poorly stocked. The cashier was an older man who looked at us with a mix of curiosity and irritation. Tom asked for directions back to the main road, but the man's answers were vague and unhelpful. As we left the store, I saw a group of people standing outside, talking and pointing at our car. My heart began to race. It felt like we were being watched and followed. Tom tried to drive out, but the road signs and landmarks were no longer familiar. Suddenly, we found ourselves on a road that seemed to lead out of the community, but it was blocked by a makeshift barricade. A few locals stood there, looking stern and unfriendly. They waved us to stop, and Tom had no choice but to comply. One of the men approached our car. He was rough-looking and had an intimidating presence. He asked us what we were doing in their community. Tom tried to explain that we were lost and just wanted to leave, but the man's expression didn't soften. The man said we were not allowed to leave until we were properly checked. He seemed to be the leader, or at least in charge of the situation. I was terrified, feeling like something was seriously wrong. I whispered to Tom that we needed to get out of there quickly. Tom agreed, and while the man was distracted by a radio call, Tom started the car and tried to drive around the barricade. The locals started shouting and running towards us. My heart pounded as we raced down the road, trying to find any way out of this hostile place. We drove for what felt like hours, making several wrong turns and trying to avoid being followed. The local shouts grew faint behind us, but we didn't stop to check. We finally found a road that looked like it could lead back to a more populated area. After driving for a while, we saw a highway sign that brought us some relief. We were back on a known route and could see more cars on the road. We stopped at a rest area to catch our breath and gather ourselves. We couldn't believe what had just happened. The community had felt like a trap, and we were lucky to have escaped. We made our way back to the cabin, feeling a mix of relief and lingering fear. We decided to cut our trip short and head back home. I was staying at a hotel with my friend, Sarah. We were in town for a concert, just a weekend trip to have some fun. We got our room keys, went up to our room, and settled in. The hotel wasn't anything fancy, just a typical mid-range place, but it was clean and comfortable. After a long day of travel, we decided to get some sleep. Sarah said she was going to grab a drink from the vending machine down the hall. I was tired and told her I'd wait for her in the room. She grabbed her key and left. I lay down on the bed, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. 10 minutes passed, then 15. I started to get worried. Sarah wasn't the type to take this long for something simple. I got up and went to the door, opened it, and looked down the hallway. It was empty. I called out her name, but there was no answer. My heart started to pound in my chest. I stepped out of the room and walked to the vending machines. No sign of her. I went down to the front desk and asked if they'd seen her. The night clerk gave me a puzzled look and said no one matching her description had come by. I insisted she was just getting a drink. The clerk checked the security cameras but said they didn't see anyone in the hallways or near the vending machines. Panic set in. I went back to the room, hoping she'd return. An hour passed. I called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Something was very wrong. I decided to go back to the front desk and demand they take another look. This time, a different clerk was there. I explained everything again, and they checked the records. According to their system, Sarah had never checked in. They had no record of her at all. I was furious and scared. I knew she was here. I had seen her walk out of the room. The clerk suggested I might be mistaken. Maybe she checked into another hotel. But I knew that wasn't true. I went back to the room, trying to think. As I sat there, I noticed something strange. A piece of paper sticking out from under the bed. I pulled it out and saw it was a business card for a local nightclub. It seemed out of place. I decided to investigate. The nightclub was a seedy place in a rundown part of town. I showed the card to the bouncer, and he let me in without a word. The inside was dark and loud, filled with smoke and the smell of alcohol. I felt out of place and nervous, but I had to find Sarah. I wandered around, asking people if they'd seen her. Most ignored me, but one man pulled me aside. He said he saw a girl matching her description with a group of men. He told me they were part of a trafficking ring operating out of the hotel. My blood ran cold. He warned me to leave and forget I ever saw anything. But I couldn't just leave Sarah. I went back to the hotel, my mind racing. I needed a plan. I couldn't trust the staff, and I couldn't call the police without proof. I decided to check the basement, thinking maybe there was more to this place. I found a door marked employees only and managed to slip inside when no one was looking. The basement was dark and damp, filled with storage boxes and cleaning supplies. I carefully made my way through, trying not to make any noise. At the far end, I saw a door slightly ajar with light spilling out. I crept closer and peeked inside. My heart nearly stopped. There were several men inside, talking in hushed tones. I saw Sarah, tied to a chair, looking terrified. I knew I had to act fast. I quietly backed away and looked for something to use as a weapon. I found a heavy metal pipe and gripped it tightly. I waited for the right moment, then burst into the room, swinging the pipe with all my strength. I caught one of the men off guard, knocking him to the ground. The others turned to me, shocked. I yelled at Sarah to run. She struggled to her feet, and I fought off the men as best I could. We managed to escape the room and run back upstairs. We burst out of the basement and into the lobby. I screamed for help, and this time, a few guests took notice. I decided to rent a farmhouse out in the country for a few weeks to work on my novel. It was isolated, just what I needed for some quiet writing time. The place was old, with creaky floors and thick walls. It felt like it was miles away from anything or anyone. One night, the storm came in. The rain was relentless, and the wind howled through the trees. It was hard to concentrate with all the noise. Around midnight, as I was trying to focus on a scene, I heard something that made my heart skip a beat. There were noises downstairs, thumps, shuffling, and the unmistakable sound of something breaking. I froze, straining to hear. The sounds were getting closer, and I realized someone was trying to break into the house. My first instinct was to hide, but then I thought about the layout of the farmhouse. There were 2 floors, and my room was on the second. If they got in, they would eventually make their way upstairs. I needed to stay calm and think. I quietly went to the window and peeked out through the blinds. All I saw was the rain pouring down and the occasional flash of lightning. No sign of anyone outside. The noises continued, louder now, and it was clear they were inside the house. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal out here. My heart was pounding. I had to get out of the house and find a way to contact the police. I checked the back door. It was locked tight. I decided to use the old fireplace as a means of escape. It had a small, hidden door that led to a crawl space. I opened it carefully and crawled in. The space was tight and filled with dust, but it was better than being found. The noises downstairs were growing more chaotic. I could hear voices now, harsh and low. I knew they were looking for something, and it wasn't long before I heard them climbing the stairs. My head was spinning. I crawled deeper into the space, trying to ignore the creeping feeling of claustrophobia. I waited, my breath shallow, listening for any sounds that might indicate their next move. I heard them moving around upstairs, checking rooms. I tried to keep my mind focused on the plan. If I could get to the nearest neighbor, they might be able to call the police. The farmhouse was surrounded by dense woods, and I had to be careful navigating through them in the storm. When the noises seemed to move away, I slowly and quietly crawled out of the space. The upstairs was silent, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they would be back. I needed to be quick. I slipped out of the house through a small side door that led to the back. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind nearly knocked me over as I stumbled into the woods. The trees were thick, and I had trouble seeing where I was going. I followed what I remembered was the path to the neighbor's house, but everything looked different in the storm. I tried to keep my steps light, but the mud made it hard to move fast. I kept going, even though I felt like I was moving in circles. Every crack of a branch or distant thunder made me jump. I couldn't afford to lose my way. The neighbor's house was my only hope. Finally, I saw a light in the distance. I pushed through the underbrush and stumbled into the driveway. I banged on the door, shouting for help. The lights flicked on, and a woman opened the door, looking startled. I quickly explained what happened, and she called the police for me. I could hear sirens in the distance, and it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. We waited together, her offering me a dry towel and some warm tea to calm my nerves. The police arrived and went to the farmhouse. They found the intruders, who turned out to be a group of thieves looking for valuables. They had been in the house for hours, but they didn't find anything because I had hidden everything away. I was shaken, but I was safe. The police assured me that I could return to the farmhouse, but I decided against it. I stayed with the neighbor for the rest of the night and went home the next morning. The storm had finally passed, but the experience left me rattled. It was a night like any other, except for the relentless rain hammering against my windows. I was working late in my home office, trying to finish up a project that had me behind schedule. The storm outside was so loud that it drowned out everything else, making it hard to focus. The occasional flash of lightning would light up the room, only to be swallowed by darkness again. Around midnight, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number. Normally, I wouldn't answer, but I was expecting a call from a client, so I picked it up. The voice on the other end was rough, almost like it was distorted by static. "Jenna," the voice said, "I know what you did." My heart skipped a beat. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, then the voice said, "You don't need to play dumb. You know exactly what I'm talking about." I felt a chill run down my spine. I had no idea who this person was or what they were referring to. "I think you've got the wrong number," I said. The voice laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Don't play games with me. I know about the emails you've been sending. I know about your secret meetings. I hadn't been sending any emails I shouldn't have. And as for secret meetings, there were none." I felt a growing panic. "Listen, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to hang up now." Before I could, the call ended. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. I tried calling back, but the number was disconnected. I felt uneasy but tried to push it aside. Maybe it was just a prank. But then the calls kept coming. Every time I answered, the caller would say something that made no sense or repeated vague threats. They knew details about my life, my job, my routines, even the names of a few friends. It was unsettling, to say the least. I tried to trace the calls, but the number always came up as blocked or unavailable. My attempts to block the number didn't work, they just kept calling from different ones. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger. After an hour of this, I noticed something odd. Every now and then, I'd see a shadow moving past the window when the lightning flashed. I tried to dismiss it as the effect of the rain or my imagination. But as the night dragged on, the feeling of dread only intensified. I decided to check outside. I carefully peeked out through the curtains, trying not to draw attention. The rain was coming down in sheets, and visibility was almost zero. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling that someone was out there, hiding in the dark, was almost palpable. I went back inside, trying to calm myself. I locked all the doors and windows, and the calls continued. The callers seemed to be enjoying my fear, taunting me with personal details and telling me that my time was running out. I knew I had to do something. I called the police, but they told me to stay on the line and keep them updated if anything happened. They said they'd send someone over as soon as they could, but it might take a while given the storm. I felt alone, stranded, and vulnerable. Suddenly, a loud thud came from the back of the house. I jumped, my heart racing. I grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat I kept for protection. The power flickered, and I knew the storm was causing disruptions. I went to the back door, shining the flashlight outside. The rain was coming down so hard that it was difficult to see anything. I carefully opened the door and stepped out, the mud squishing beneath my shoes. The backyard was empty, but I noticed a set of muddy footprints leading from the edge of the yard to the back door. They looked fresh, and the sight made my blood run cold. I quickly went back inside, locked the door, and called the police again, telling them about the footprints. They promised someone would be there soon. I sat in my office, waiting, the fear making it hard to concentrate. The calls had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. I felt like a sitting duck, waiting for something terrible to happen. After what felt like hours, there was a knock on the door. I hesitated but finally opened it to find two police officers standing there, soaked from the rain. They came in and began to investigate, checking around the property and asking me about the calls and any suspicious activity. As they spoke with me, I felt a bit of relief, but the dread never fully left. They did a thorough search of the area but found no one. They took the details of the calls and the muddy footprints and promised to keep an eye on things. Once they left, I locked up the house and tried to get some sleep. I left a light on and stayed close to my phone, ready to call for help if needed. The storm continued to rage outside, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a fitful sleep. In the morning, the storm had passed, and the sun was out. The police had not reported any incidents from the night before. The unsettling feeling of being watched began to fade, but I knew I'd be more cautious from now on. The calls eventually stopped, and I never heard from the mysterious caller again. It was pouring rain when I left the office that night. The storm had been building all day, and now it was a full-blown downpour. I hurried to my car, huddling under my umbrella, and saw Tom standing at the entrance. He looked soaked, even with his raincoat on. "Need a ride?" I called out. Tom smiled, relieved. "Thanks, Rachel. I appreciate it." He climbed into the passenger seat, and I cranked up the heat. We chatted about work as I navigated the slick roads. The rain was so heavy, it was hard to see beyond a few feet. The wipers were working overtime, but it barely made a difference. We came to a red light, and I glanced over at Tom. He seemed tense, his fingers drumming on his knee. "Everything okay?" I asked. He nodded, but didn't say anything. The light turned green, and I started to drive. A few blocks later, I noticed Tom wasn't in the car anymore. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't heard the door open or felt any movement. I pulled over, panic rising. How could he just disappear? I got out, looking around, calling his name. The rain was relentless, soaking me in seconds. There was no sign of him anywhere. I got back in the car, my mind racing. Did he jump out? Why didn't I hear anything? I decided to head back to the office, thinking maybe he had gone back there for some reason. When I arrived, the building was dark and locked up. I knocked on the door, hoping the night guard might have seen something. No answer. I was alone. I drove around the area, circling the blocks near where he vanished, but there was no sign of Tom. Feeling desperate, I called the police. They said they would send someone out to take a report, but their tone made it clear they thought he probably just decided to walk home. I sat in my car, shivering from the cold and the fear. Something was very wrong. I decided to go to Tom's apartment, hoping he might be there. When I got there, his lights were off. I banged on his door, but no one answered. As I turned to leave, a figure stepped out of the shadows. I jumped, recognizing one of Tom's neighbors. He looked at me with a mix of curiosity and concern. "You looking for Tom?" he asked. I nodded. "Have you seen him?" He shook his head. "Not since this morning." "Is something wrong?" I explained what had happened, and he looked even more worried. "Tom's been acting strange lately. He mentioned something about being followed, but I thought he was just stressed from work." The rain kept pounding down as I got back into my car. My phone rang, and I saw it was an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. "Rachel," a voice said. It was Tom, but he sounded scared. "Tom, where are you?" "I don't have much time." "Don't trust them," he whispered. The line went dead. My hands were shaking as I tried to call him back, but it went straight to voicemail. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew I couldn't go to the police. They wouldn't believe me. I drove around aimlessly, trying to piece together what little I knew. My thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a black car that seemed to be following me. Every turn I made, it was right there behind me. Panic set in. I took a sharp turn down a side street and sped up, hoping to lose them. My heart was pounding as I navigated the narrow, rain-slicked roads. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the car still behind me. I drove towards the outskirts of town, hoping the winding roads would help me shake them. The car was relentless, though, staying on my tail. I saw a narrow dirt road and turned onto it, the car bouncing over the rough terrain. The road led into a dense forest. The trees closed in around me, and the headlights of the car behind me disappeared. I kept driving until I found a small clearing, then turned off my engine and lights, hoping they wouldn't find me. I sat there in the dark, the rain hammering on the roof, trying to calm my racing heart. I had to figure out what was happening and why Tom had disappeared. I couldn't go home, it wasn't safe. After what felt like hours, the rain finally started to let up. I decided to head back to town, keeping to the back roads. I needed answers, and the only place I could think of was Tom's apartment. When I arrived, the building was dark and quiet. I snuck in through a side door that I knew was always left unlocked. I crept up to Tom's apartment and picked the lock, a skill I had learned years ago and never thought I'd need. Inside, the place was a mess. Papers were scattered everywhere, and it looked like someone had been searching for something. I found Tom's laptop on the table and opened it, hoping for a clue. As I searched through his files, I found a folder marked Danger. Inside were documents and photos detailing some kind of conspiracy. There were pictures of people I recognized from around town, notes about meetings, and lists of names. It was all connected to some illegal activities that Tom had uncovered. Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside the door. I quickly closed the laptop and hid behind the couch. The door creaked open, and I saw a pair of boots step inside. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. The person moved around the apartment, searching through the mess. After what felt like an eternity, they left, and I heard the door lock behind them. I waited a few minutes before coming out of my hiding spot. I grabbed Tom's laptop and slipped out of the apartment, heading back to my car. I needed to find a safe place to go through the files and figure out who I could trust. I drove to a nearby motel and checked in under a fake name. In the safety of my room, I opened the laptop again and went through everything. It was clear that Tom had stumbled onto something big, and now we were both targets. I knew I had to get this information to someone who could help, but I had to be careful. I spent the rest of the night making copies of the files and sending them to trusted contacts, hoping they would take it seriously. As dawn approached, I felt a little safer. The storm had passed, but I knew the danger wasn't over. I had to stay hidden until I could be sure the information was out and Tom was safe. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and fear. I moved from place to place, never staying in one spot for too long. I heard from one of my contacts that the information had been leaked to the press, and the authorities were investigating. Finally, I got a call from Tom. He was safe, hiding out in a different city. He thanked me for helping him, and we agreed to lay low until things blew over. It took months for the dust to settle, but eventually, the people behind the conspiracy were arrested, and things started to go back to normal. I never saw Tom again, but we kept in touch through encrypted messages. That rainy night changed everything. I learned to be more cautious, to trust my instincts, and to always be aware of my surroundings. Last night was a shift like no other. I work as a security guard in a big office building downtown. Usually, it's pretty quiet. I make my rounds, check the cameras, and make sure everything is locked up. But last night, something happened that I still can't shake. It was around 1 a.m. when I got a call on the building's emergency line. It's a direct line, meant for real emergencies only. I answered it right away. A woman's voice was on the other end, trembling and scared. She said she was being held against her will somewhere in the building. I asked her where she was, trying to stay calm. She said she didn't know exactly, but described a room with no windows and a heavy door. My mind raced. I knew the building inside and out, and I couldn't think of a room like that. I told her to stay quiet and that I would find her. I grabbed my flashlight and set out to check every floor. I started on the ground floor and worked my way up. Each floor was empty, just dark offices and locked doors. I kept the phone on me, hoping she'd call back with more information. As I reached the top floor, I felt a chill. The top floor was supposed to be empty. No businesses, no offices, just storage. But the woman's voice was so real, so desperate. I checked every storage room, but they were all empty. I went back to the security office to check the cameras. I rewound the footage, looking for anything unusual. That's when I saw something strange. On one of the cameras, I saw a shadow moving in a hallway on the top floor. It was quick, but definitely there. I headed back up, heart pounding. I checked the hallway where I saw the shadow, but there was nothing. No signs of anyone. I started to think I was imagining things. But then, I heard a faint noise, like a door creaking. I followed the sound to a wall at the end of the hallway. It looked like a regular wall, but when I pressed on it, it moved. A hidden door. I couldn't believe it. I pushed it open and found a dark staircase leading down. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs. At the bottom was a heavy metal door, just like the woman described. I knocked softly and called out to her. She answered right away, her voice full of relief. I told her to stand back and tried the handle. It was locked. I looked around and saw a keypad on the wall. I had no idea what the code could be. I asked her if she knew, but she said her captors always punched it in too fast for her to see. I had to think fast. I remembered seeing a keypad in the security office, with a list of default codes for emergency use. I told her I'd be right back and ran up the stairs. My legs felt like lead as I sprinted to the office. I found the list and ran back down. I tried the first code, nothing. The second, still nothing. On the third try, the door clicked open. I pushed it open and saw her, tied to a chair in the middle of the room. She looked terrified, but unarmed. I rushed to her and untied her. She thanked me over and over, tears streaming down her face. I told her we needed to get out of there before her captors came back. We hurried up the stairs and out into the hallway. Just as we reached the main hallway, I heard voices. The captors were coming back. I led her to a nearby office and we hid inside, holding our breath. The voices got closer, then stopped right outside the door. I could see shadows moving under the door. They were looking for her. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. But after a few tense minutes, they moved on. We waited a bit longer, then made our way out. We got to the ground floor and out the front door. I called the police as soon as we were outside. They arrived quickly and took the woman to safety. They searched the building but didn't find the captors. They had vanished. The police questioned me for hours. I told them everything I knew, but there were still so many questions. Who were these people? Why was she being held? And how did they know the building so well? I didn't get any answers that night. I went home, exhausted and shaken. I couldn't sleep, replaying everything in my mind. The woman's voice, the hidden door, the shadows under the door. It all felt like a nightmare. Today, I'm still trying to process it all. The building feels different now, less safe. I keep thinking about that woman and what she went through. I'm just glad I was there to help, even if I don't have all the answers. I don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe again, but I do know one thing. I'll always trust my instincts. If I hadn't listened to that call, who knows what might have happened to her. I stayed late in the university lab that night, trying to finish up some research I had been working on for weeks. It was quiet and the only sound was the soft hum of the equipment. I was so focused that I didn't notice the time passing by. Around midnight, I heard the door creak open. I looked up to see someone standing in the doorway. It was Jason, a fellow student from one of my classes. I barely knew him, but I had seen him around campus. "Hey, Mia," he said, casually walking in. "Working late, huh?" I nodded, trying to be polite but not really in the mood for a chat. "Yeah, just trying to get this done." Jason didn't leave. Instead, he moved closer and started looking over my shoulder at the data on my screen. I felt uncomfortable with how close he was. "What are you working on?" he asked. I tried to explain briefly, focusing on the research rather than the specifics. I didn't want to reveal too much. Jason kept asking detailed questions, almost pushing me to explain every step. His questions started feeling invasive, and his manner was strangely intense. He seemed genuinely interested, but something about the way he was probing made me uneasy. I gave short answers and tried to redirect the conversation, but he wouldn't let up. His eyes were focused on my screen, and he occasionally glanced at the stack of papers on my desk. As I answered another one of his questions, I noticed he was no longer just curious. His questions had shifted to more personal aspects of my research and the methods I used. It felt like he was trying to dig into areas that were confidential. "Have you had any problems with your experiments?" he asked, his tone growing more insistent. "Any unexpected results?" I sensed something was off. I had always been cautious about sharing detailed information about my work, especially since some of it was sensitive. "Nothing out of the ordinary," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Why do you ask?" Jason didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around the lab, as if checking to see if anyone was nearby. "I've heard some things about your project," he said finally, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I just want to make sure you're not missing anything." His demeanor made me more nervous. I could tell he was not just a curious student, there was something more to his interest. I felt a growing sense of dread. I needed to protect my research and, more importantly, keep myself safe. I decided to act as though I was still engaged in the conversation, but looked for an opportunity to get him out of the lab. "Actually, I think I need to finish this up. Can we talk another time?" I said, hoping he would take the hint. Jason didn't seem to take the hint. Instead, he sat down at one of the chairs and continued to ask questions, now about the security of my data. "How do you keep your files secure?" he asked, leaning closer. "Do you have backups?" I was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. "I have standard procedures for data security," I replied, trying to sound firm. "I really need to get this done now. Can you please leave?" He didn't move. Instead, he looked at me with a strange expression, almost as if he was assessing whether or not I was lying. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, and it made me shiver. Realizing that staying there any longer would only make things worse, I decided to take action. I reached for my phone and pretended to make a call. I said into the phone, "Hi, yes, this is Mia. I need some help in the lab." Jason's eyes widened slightly. He stood up abruptly. "Okay, I'll leave you to it," he said, his voice now strained. He quickly walked toward the door, but not before giving me one last look. It was clear he wasn't finished with me, but I needed him out of the lab. As soon as he was gone, I locked the door behind him and checked my research materials. Everything seemed to be in place, but I wasn't taking any chances. I backed up my data and made sure my files were secured. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stayed in the lab for a bit longer, making sure that no one else would come in. I was on high alert, knowing that Jason's behavior could mean trouble. The next day, I reported the incident to the campus security and my supervisor. They took the matter seriously and assured me they would look into it. I also made sure to change any passwords and security codes related to my research. Jason didn't show up in any of my classes after that, and I didn't hear from him again. The whole experience left me shaken, but I was relieved that I had managed to protect my work and myself. I was more cautious from then on, always being careful about who I spoke to about my research. It was a lesson learned the hard way about how important it is to stay vigilant, especially when dealing with people who seem too interested in what you're doing. I was on vacation in Barcelona, soaking up the summer sun and enjoying the vibrant energy of the city. Jake, my best friend, and I were exploring a bustling market that was packed with tourists and locals alike. The place was alive with color and noise, street performers, vendors shouting their specials, and the smell of fresh food everywhere. We were in the middle of haggling over some souvenirs when I noticed Jake's backpack was open. I glanced over and saw him struggling to zip it up, distracted by a street artist's performance. Moments later, I felt a sharp pang of panic when I realized my passport, which was in the side pocket of his bag, was missing. I quickly told Jake, and we retraced our steps, searching every stall and corner of the market. Jake tried to stay calm, but I could see the worry on his face. We approached a few vendors and asked if they had seen anything suspicious. Most shook their heads or offered sympathetic looks but had no useful information. We decided to report the theft to the police. We went to a nearby station and filed a report. The officers were kind and promised to look into it, but I could tell they were swamped with cases. They suggested we keep an eye on the market, as thefts like this were common in busy areas. Jake and I went back to the market, keeping a low profile, hoping the thief might return or that we could spot someone acting suspiciously. After hours of watching people come and go, we were about to give up when Jake noticed a man who kept glancing our way. He was acting strangely, moving from one stall to another with a kind of furtive purpose. Jake suggested we follow him discreetly. We trailed behind the man, keeping a safe distance. The man led us out of the market and down a series of narrow alleys. The alleys were dark and dimly lit, giving me an uneasy feeling. The man finally stopped at a rundown building and slipped inside. We waited for a few minutes before approaching the building. It looked abandoned, but there was a faint light coming from a window on the second floor. Jake and I exchanged nervous glances before deciding to investigate. We crept up the stairs, trying to be as quiet as possible. As we reached the second floor, we could hear muffled voices. Jake peeked around the corner and saw the man talking to several other people. The room was filled with papers and what looked like stolen goods. It became clear that they were running a larger operation. Jake and I stayed hidden, trying to gather as much information as possible. One of the men was talking about passports and identification, which made my blood run cold. They were discussing selling stolen passports on the black market. I felt a rush of fear. They had my passport, and it seemed like they were planning something bigger. Realizing the danger we were in, we decided we needed to leave and get help. We slowly made our way back down the stairs, trying to avoid making any noise. Just as we reached the exit, one of the men from the group spotted us. We could hear him shouting, and soon, we heard footsteps pounding after us. Jake and I bolted through the alleys, our hearts racing. The narrow, winding streets made it difficult to know where we were going. We could hear the men shouting behind us, growing closer with each step. We had to think fast. We ducked into a small shop that looked closed but had a small space where we could hide. We huddled in the back, barely able to breathe. We could hear the men outside, searching and calling for us. The minutes felt like hours. After what seemed like an eternity, the voices outside faded away. We waited in silence, our ears straining to catch any sound. Once we were sure it was safe, we slowly made our way out of the shop and back to the main street. We found a nearby police station and explained everything to them. The officers took our statements and promised to investigate the building we had described. They advised us to stay in a secure location and not return to the market until the situation was resolved. Jake and I returned to our hotel, shaken but relieved. The police eventually recovered my passport and arrested several people involved in the operation. It was a long process, but we were grateful that we were safe and that the criminals were caught. The rest of our vacation was subdued, and we spent the remaining days exploring the city in a more cautious manner. The experience was terrifying, but it taught us to stay alert and trust our instincts. We were thankful to be safe and able to return home without any further incidents. I took my dog, Max, to a remote cabin for a summer vacation. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from the city. The cabin was deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. I was looking forward to some quiet time, just me and Max. The first couple of days were perfect. We hiked, swam in the lake, and relaxed on the porch. The air was fresh, and the only sounds were birds and the rustling of leaves. Max loved it too, running around and exploring. One afternoon, while we were on a hike, I heard gunshots in the distance. It startled me, but I assumed it was hunters. Hunting season wasn't for another month, though, which made me uneasy. I decided to head back to the cabin. As we walked back, I saw something that made my heart race. A group of men, about 5 of them, were gathered around a deer they had just shot. They were laughing and talking loudly. One of them noticed me, and their conversation stopped abruptly. I quickly turned and started walking away, trying to act normal. I didn't want any trouble. Max sensed my tension and stayed close. The hair on his neck was standing up. I could hear footsteps behind me, getting closer. "Hey, you," one of the men shouted. I didn't turn around. I just kept walking, faster now. Max crawled softly. The footsteps quickened. Panic set in. I broke into a run, Max sprinting beside me. I could hear them chasing us. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. The cabin was still a good distance away. I veered off the trail, hoping to lose them in the dense woods. Max followed, weaving through the trees. We ran for what felt like an eternity. My lungs burned, and my legs were weak. I glanced back and saw the men still pursuing us. They were closer now, shouting angrily. I needed to find a place to hide. I spotted a small cave and ducked inside, pulling Max with me. We crouched in the darkness, trying to be as quiet as possible. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could hear the men searching nearby. "She went this way," one of them yelled. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find us. Max was silent, sensing the danger. Footsteps approached the cave. I pressed myself against the cold rock wall, trying to make myself invisible. A shadow passed by the entrance. I could hear them talking, but I couldn't make out the words. They were so close. I closed my eyes, terrified. After what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away. They were searching elsewhere. We stayed hidden for a long time, until I was sure they were gone. Slowly, I emerged from the cave, Max by my side. The woods were eerily quiet now. I knew we had to get back to the cabin and call for help. We moved cautiously, staying off the main trails. Every snap of a twig made me jump. I was constantly looking over my shoulder. When we finally reached the cabin, I locked the door and closed all the curtains. I grabbed my phone and called the local authorities, explaining what had happened. They told me to stay put and that they would send someone right away. The wait was agonizing. I kept expecting the men to burst through the door at any moment. When the police arrived, I felt a huge wave of relief. They searched the area and found evidence of the poachers. It turned out they had been illegally hunting in the woods for some time. They were arrested, and I was assured it was safe. The rest of the vacation was ruined, of course. I couldn't shake the fear and anxiety. We left the next day, and I vowed never to return to such a remote place alone again. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, but it turned into a nightmare. Max and I are safe now, but the memory still haunts me. Every time I hear a sudden noise or see a shadow in the corner of my eye, I remember those terrifying moments in the woods. Our romantic getaway started like a dream. Tom and I rented a remote cabin far away from the city noise. We wanted peace and quiet, just the two of us. The first couple of days were perfect. We hiked, cooked together, and enjoyed the serenity of the woods. On the third night, we were sitting by the fireplace. The only sound was the crackling of the logs. Suddenly, there was a loud bang at the door. We looked at each other, startled. It was almost midnight, and we weren't expecting anyone. Tom got up to check, while I stayed behind, my heart pounding. Tom peeked through the window beside the door and froze. He turned to me, his face pale. "Lisa, there are men outside. They have guns." My stomach dropped. My mind raced, thinking of what to do. Tom quickly locked the door and turned off the lights. We crouched behind the couch, trying to stay calm. The men outside started shouting, demanding we open the door. They banged on the windows, trying to break in. We had no cell service out here, so calling for help wasn't an option. We needed to find another way to signal for help. I remembered the emergency flare kit we had brought with us. Tom grabbed a flare gun from the cupboard. We could hear the men getting more aggressive, smashing the windows. I felt a chill run down my spine as I heard glass shattering. We had to act fast. Tom told me to stay low while he went to the bedroom window to shoot the flare. As Tom was about to open the window, one of the men broke through the kitchen window. I screamed, and Tom rushed back to help me. The intruder was inside, pointing his gun at us. Tom and I stood frozen, not knowing what to do. The man demanded money and valuables. Tom tried to reason with him, offering what little we had. But it wasn't enough. The man became more aggressive, threatening us. Just then, we heard more glass breaking from another room. The rest of the group was inside the cabin. Our situation was getting worse by the minute. One of the men grabbed me, pulling me away from Tom. I struggled, trying to get free. Tom lunged at him, and they started fighting. The man hit Tom with the butt of his gun, knocking him to the ground. I screamed, fearing for Tom's life. Another man pointed his gun at me, telling me to shut up. In the chaos, I noticed Tom gesturing towards the flare gun, which had fallen under the table. I slowly moved towards it, hoping the men wouldn't notice. My hands were shaking, but I managed to grab it. I aimed it at the man closest to me and fired. The bright light blinded him, and he dropped his gun. Tom seized the opportunity, tackling the man who had hit him. They struggled on the floor while I grabbed the fallen gun. My hands were trembling, but I pointed it at the other intruders, yelling at them to get out. They hesitated, realizing we were not as helpless as they thought. The man Tom was fighting managed to break free and ran out the door. The others followed, cursing and threatening to come back. We didn't wait to see if they would. Tom and I quickly barricaded the doors and windows with whatever we could find. We knew they might return, so we had to be ready. We spent the rest of the night on high alert, watching and listening for any signs of the men coming back. The cabin was eerily quiet, except for our heavy breathing and the occasional crack of the fire. We held each other, trying to stay calm and think of our next move. At dawn, we decided it was too dangerous to stay any longer. We packed our essentials and prepared to leave. We knew the way back to the main road was long and treacherous, but it was our only option. As we stepped outside, the morning sun cast long shadows, making everything look surreal. We moved quickly but cautiously through the woods, constantly looking over our shoulders. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart race. Tom held my hand tightly, assuring me we would make it out of this nightmare. We just needed to keep moving. Hours passed, and we finally reached the main road. We were exhausted but relieved to see a car approaching. We flagged it down, and the driver, seeing our desperate state, agreed to help us. We told him everything, and he drove us to the nearest town. At the local police station, we recounted our ordeal. The officers took our statements and assured us they would search for the men. They also sent a team to the cabin to investigate. We were still in shock, but knowing the police were involved brought some comfort. The officers arranged for us to stay in a nearby hotel until we could return home safely. That night, we barely slept, haunted by the memories of the attack. The reality of what happened was sinking in, and it was hard to process. We were grateful to be alive, but the fear lingered. The next morning, we received news that the police had found evidence of the intruders at the cabin but hadn't caught them yet. We were advised to leave the area and stay somewhere safe. Tom and I packed our bags, ready to put as much distance as possible between us and the nightmare. On the drive back home, we barely spoke. The experience had shaken us deeply, and we knew it would take time to heal. We decided to seek counseling to help us cope with the trauma. We needed to support each other and rebuild our sense of security. As the weeks went by, we slowly started to feel more like ourselves. The nightmares became less frequent, and we found comfort in our routines. We stayed in close contact with the police, who eventually caught the intruders. Knowing they were behind bars helped us sleep a little easier. Our romantic getaway had turned into a terrifying ordeal, but we survived. The experience brought us closer, making us realize how much we meant to each other. I had always looked forward to our summer vacation, and this year we decided to take a cruise. It seemed like the perfect way to relax and see some new places. My husband, Mark, and I had booked a week-long trip on a large cruise ship. The first few days went smoothly. We enjoyed the sunny weather, great food, and the variety of activities the ship offered. One evening, as we were walking along one of the upper decks, we noticed a crew member who seemed out of place. His name tag read Chris, but there was something off about him. He didn't fit in with the rest of the crew, who were all cheerful and professional. This crew member moved too quickly and always seemed to be looking around nervously. We brushed it off at first, thinking maybe he was just new or had a rough day. But as the days passed, his behavior got stranger. He would often be seen around areas of the ship where crew members usually didn't go, and sometimes he would be in places where he shouldn't be, like the engine room or supply closets. One night, we were having dinner in the main dining room when we noticed Chris talking quietly with another crew member who seemed just as nervous. They were whispering, and whenever someone came close, they quickly changed the subject. Mark and I exchanged glances. It was clear something was not right. After dinner, we decided to follow Chris discreetly. We saw him sneak into a restricted area of the ship. The door was usually locked, but he had a key card and went in without hesitation. We were both curious and concerned. Mark suggested we go to the ship's security office and report our concerns, but I felt uneasy about doing that without more evidence. What if we were wrong and caused trouble for someone who was just having a bad day? That night, we couldn't stop thinking about Chris and his suspicious behavior. We decided to try and gather more information. The next morning, Mark noticed Chris in a quiet part of the ship, where he seemed to be transferring something from a large duffel bag into a small box. The whole situation was unsettling. We knew we had to act carefully. We didn't want to put ourselves in danger or make a mistake that could ruin someone's life. We decided to document what we saw as best as we could without drawing attention to ourselves. We used our phones to take discreet pictures of Chris and the areas he was visiting. Once we had enough evidence, we went to the ship's security office. We were anxious but knew it was the right thing to do. We showed the security officer our photos and explained what we had seen. He took us seriously and assured us he would investigate. The security officer asked us to remain on standby and avoid contact with Chris. We agreed and spent the day nervously waiting. We kept a low profile, avoiding any further encounters with Chris while hoping for the best. The idea of being on a ship with someone who might have dangerous intentions was frightening. Later that afternoon, we were called into the security office. The officer informed us that Chris had been apprehended. It turned out that Chris was indeed an impostor. He had managed to get a job on the ship by using fake credentials. The security team found that he had been planning to steal valuable items from the ship's safe and had also been involved in smuggling illegal goods. The authorities were notified, and Chris was taken into custody. It was a relief to know that we had helped prevent a potentially dangerous situation. The rest of our trip went smoothly, and we felt a lot safer knowing the threat was gone.